Darkness. Not the comforting dark of a closed room or a moonless night, but a thick, cloying, absolute dark that pressed against his eyelids and seeped into his lungs. Mark's first conscious thought was that he was drowning in ink. He gasped, a ragged sound that echoed strangely in the confined space, and his hands flew out, scrabbling against cold, damp stone. His fingers, short, thick, and tipped with ragged nails, found purchase on a rough wall. He pushed himself upright, his head swimming. Memories flickered, disjointed and painful. A truck's headlights blinding him. The screech of tires. Then, nothing. And now this. Where was he? A hospital? A cave? He tried to speak, to call out, but what emerged was a guttural croak, a sound utterly alien to his own ears. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He forced his eyes open, blinking against the gloom. Slowly, details resolved. He was in a cavern, low-ceilinged and narrow, lit by the faint, phosphorescent glow of strange fungi clinging to the walls. The air was cool and carried the scent of wet earth and something else, something musky and wild. He looked down at his hands, and his breath hitched. They were green. A sickly, mottled green, the skin leathery and covered in coarse hair. His arms were wiry, corded with muscle he didn't remember having, and ended in those stubby, clawed fingers. He wore only a crude loincloth of tanned hide. A wave of nausea washed over him. This wasn't his body. This wasn't human. Status, he thought desperately, the word surfacing from some deep, instinctual place. As if in response, a translucent blue screen flickered into existence before his eyes, hovering in the air. The characters were sharp, glowing with an ethereal light. Name * mark, designation, Goblin Scout number 7342. Race * Goblin. Level * 1. Health * 15/15. Mana * 0/0. Stamina * 20/20. Attributes *. Strength, 4. Dexterity, 6. Constitution, 3. Intelligence, 8, anomaly detected. Wisdom, 7, anomaly detected. Skills *. Minor stealth, LVU 1. Crude crafting, LVU 1. Basic observation, LVU 1. Traits *. Absolute neutrality, unique, divine glitch. Description, aggro generation permanently locked at 0. Hostile entities cannot perceive user as a threat unless direct physical contact is initiated. User is effectively invisible to aggression detection systems. Warning, system anomaly logged. Mark stared, his mind reeling. Goblin. Level 1. Stats that were pitifully low. And that trait. Absolute neutrality. Aggro locked at 0. The words swam before his eyes. A game? Had he been reborn into some kind of video game world? The chosen mentioned in the outline, were they the players? And he was a mob. A trash mob. The lowest of the low, cannon fodder for adventurers to grind for experience. Despair threatened to crush him. Then, a new sound cut through the silence of the cave. A deep, rumbling growl, followed by the scrape of claws on stone. It came from the tunnel ahead, where the faint fungal light gave way to deeper shadow. Something was coming. Something big. Adrenaline surged, overriding the shock. He had to move. He scrambled to his feet, his new body surprisingly agile despite the terror. He pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The growl grew louder, accompanied by heavy, thudding footsteps. A shape emerged from the darkness. It was an owlbear. The creature was a monstrous fusion of fur and feather, standing nearly 8 feet tall on its powerful bear-like legs. Its owl's head swiveled, massive beak clicking, and its glowing amber eyes swept the cavern. It was enraged, feathers were ruffled, and a fresh, bloody wound gleamed on its shoulder. It sniffed the air, letting out another thunderous growl that vibrated through the stone. Mark froze. This was it. A level 1 Goblin Scout versus a raging owlbear, a creature that must be at least level 10 or higher. He was dead. He was so utterly, completely dead. He closed his eyes, waiting for the charge, for the rending claws. It didn't come. He cracked one eye open. The owlbear was pacing now, just 10 feet away. It swung its head toward him, those luminous eyes passing directly over his cowering form. It paused. It sniffed again, its beak opening slightly. Mark could smell its hot, carnivorous breath. But its gaze held no recognition, no aggression. It was as if he were a rock, a patch of moss on the wall. The owlbear let out a frustrated hoot, turned, and began to lick its wounded shoulder, its attention entirely diverted. It stood between him and the only visible exit from the small cavern, a slightly larger tunnel mouth from which it had come. His trait: absolute neutrality. Aggro 0. Hostile entities cannot perceive user as a threat. The words from the status screen echoed in his mind. Was it real? Could it be? The owlbear, a creature driven by instinct and rage, was ignoring him completely. Panic began to ebb, replaced by a trembling, disbelieving curiosity. He had to test it. Slowly, ever so slowly, he peeled himself away from the wall. The owlbear didn't react. He took one shuffling step forward. The creature continued grooming its wound. Emboldened, Mark began to walk, giving the massive beast a wide berth. He moved parallel to it, then angled toward the tunnel exit. His path took him within 5 feet of the owlbear's flank. He could see the individual barbs of its feathers, smell the iron tang of its blood. The owlbear's head snapped up. Mark's blood ran cold. It looked right at him. No, it looked through him. Its eyes were focused on the tunnel behind him, its ears twitching. With a final grunt, it lost interest and went back to its ministrations. Mark didn't wait. He scurried the last few feet and slipped into the tunnel, leaving the cavern and the oblivious monster behind. He leaned against the tunnel wall, breathing heavily. It worked. It actually worked. He was invisible to their aggression. A ghost in the machine. The tunnel sloped gently upward. The funnel light was brighter here, revealing a wider passage that showed signs of use, scratches on the walls, old bones picked clean. The air grew slightly warmer. He moved cautiously, his basic observation skill passively feeding him details. Tunnel. Goblin sign. Recent. The knowledge appeared in his mind, not as words, but as instinct. He was in a goblin warren, or at least on its fringes. His initial terror had morphed into a frantic, buzzing energy. He was alive. He was weak, but he had this glitch. This broken attribute. What did it mean? Could he walk through a dungeon unscathed? Could he loot treasure while monsters slept? The possibilities, terrifying and exhilarating, unfolded in his mind. He wasn't a hero. He was a glitch. A ghost. He needed to understand more. He focused on his status screen again, specifically on the absolute neutrality trait. Divine glitch. System anomaly logged. The terms were ominous. Was the system itself aware of him? Was it a bug that would be patched? The warning sent a fresh chill down his spine, but it was a distant concern compared to the immediate miracle of being ignored by an owlbear. The tunnel began to widen into a larger chamber. Light real, golden light filtered from an opening ahead. The sound of dripping water and distant, bestial cries reached his ears. He crept forward, using the rough-hewn rocks as cover. The chamber was vast, a natural cathedral of stone. A shallow, glowing pool of water sat in the center, fed by a trickle from above. But it was the far side that held his attention. Carved into the living rock was an imposing archway, flanked by two crude, menacing statues of bestial humanoids holding spears. The archway led into deeper darkness, but etched above it in jagged, glowing runes was a symbol he somehow understood, the Cleft of Grok. A dungeon entrance. And guarding it were two monsters. They were larger than him, standing on bowed legs, with warty green skin and tusks protruding from their lower jaws. Hobgoblins. Level 3. They leaned on their spears, looking bored, their eyes scanning the chamber but passing over his hiding place without a flicker of interest. This was the test. The ultimate test of his trait. Could he walk past active guards? Guards whose sole purpose was to detect and challenge intruders? His heart was a frantic drum again. This was madness. He was a level 1 goblin. They were level 3 hobgoblins. In any normal circumstance, he'd be spotted and skewered in seconds. But his circumstance was anything but normal. He thought of the owlbear. The complete, utter indifference. He thought of the status screen. Aggro generation permanently locked at 0. What's the point of being reborn, he thought, a strange, grim determination settling over him, if you don't even try to see how broken the rules are? He didn't rush. He didn't sneak in the traditional sense. He simply stood up from behind his rock and began to walk. He walked calmly, purposefully, across the chamber floor, heading directly for the dungeon entrance. He kept his eyes forward, on the archway, but his every sense was screaming, tuned to the 2 hobgoblins. He passed the glowing pool. The hobgoblin on the left scratched its armpit. The one on the right yawned, revealing a mouthful of yellowed teeth. They were 20 feet away. 15. 10. He was parallel to them now. Close enough to see the grime under their fingernails, to smell their unwashed stench. One of them hawked and spat a glob of phlegm onto the stone. It landed a foot to Mark's right. Neither looked at him. Their eyes were glazed, looking at nothing in particular. 5 feet. He was between them and the arch. The entrance yawned before him, a maw of shadow. One final step. He crossed the threshold, moving from the lit chamber into the cool darkness of the dungeon proper. He stopped and turned, looking back. The 2 hobgoblin guards remained at their posts, utterly unaware that anything or anyone had just walked right between them and into the domain they were sworn to protect. A slow, incredulous smile spread across Mark's green, goblin face. Panic was gone. Curiosity was now a blazing fire. He was in. Unseen. A ghost in the dungeon. The world of the Chosen, with all its treasures and secrets and brutal conflicts, lay ahead. And he, Mark the Goblin Scout, the mob with 0 aggro, was going to walk through it all. He took a deep breath of the dank, dungeon air and took his first step into the darkness. The cleft of Grok swallowed Mark whole as he stepped past the hobgoblin guards. The transition from the dimly lit warren tunnels to the dungeon proper was immediate and profound. Cold, damp air clung to his green skin, carrying the scent of moss, whetstone, and something faintly metallic. The walls here were no longer rough-hewn rock but carved with crude, angular runes that glowed with a sickly green luminescence, casting long, dancing shadows across the uneven floor. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the eerie silence. He was a level 1 Goblin Scout in a dungeon that, according to the flickering sign at the entrance, was recommended for chosen of level 5 and above. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to hide in some dark corner of the warren. But the memory of the owlbear's complete indifference held him steady. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of ozone and decay, and ventured deeper. The main corridor sloped downward, widening into a chamber littered with broken weapons and bones, some goblin-sized, others disturbingly larger. Mark moved with exaggerated care, his bare feet making soft, padding sounds on the stone. He paused beside a skeletal hand still clutching a rusted dagger. A status prompt flickered at the edge of his vision, as it had when he'd first awakened, rusted dagger, common, damage, 1 to 3. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold metal. The bones did not stir. The dagger did not vanish into an inventory, this world felt stubbornly physical. He left it, the weight of its uselessness a reminder of his fragility. Ahead, the corridor branched. To the left, faint echoes of guttural snarls and the clank of metal suggested active monsters. To the right, silence. Mark chose silence. The right-hand passage curved, ending at a small, circular room. In its center sat a wooden chest, banded with iron, looking utterly out of place amidst the dungeon's grim aesthetic. It was unguarded. Mark approached slowly, half expecting a trapdoor or a hidden monster.
Nothing.
He knelt, the rough stone biting into his knees. The chest had a simple latch.
With trembling hands, he lifted it.
The lid creaked open, the sound deafening in the quiet room. Inside, nestled on a bed of moth-eaten cloth, were a few silver coins, a chunk of dull ore, and a small, leather-bound book. No flashing lights, no epic loot. Mark pocketed the coins and ore, they felt real, cold, and heavy. The book's cover was embossed with a symbol he didn't recognize. He opened it. The pages were filled with dense, spidery script in a language he couldn't read. But as he stared, the words seemed to shift, resolving into something comprehensible. It was a journal, written by a chosen. His breath caught. Entry 47, the respawn point in Fallowfield is glitching again.
Lost 3 hours of progress after that ambush by the Stonefang goblins. At least death isn't permanent for us. Can't imagine being one of these mobs, permadeath must be terrifying.
The system really did a number on this world,
Mark's hands shook. Respawns. Permadeath.
The terms were game-like, but the journal's tone was weary, real.
He was a mob. If he died here, in this body, that was it. No second chances.
The confirmation was a cold knife in his gut. He stuffed the journal into a makeshift pouch he'd fashioned from a scrap of cloth, his mind reeling. He left the room and continued exploring, moving through empty side chambers and past alcoves where dormant cave rats slept, curled in balls of matted fur. They didn't so much as twitch as he passed. His absolute neutrality was a cloak, rendering him a ghost. The fear began to ebb, replaced by a giddy, dangerous curiosity. In another room, he found a second chest. This one yielded a handful of gold coins and a minor healing salve, a small clay pot filled with a gelatinous green substance.
Minor healing salve uncommon, restores 10 HP.
He took it, the pot cool in his hand. It was then that he heard voices.
Human voices, echoing from up ahead.
They were casual, conversational, cutting through the dungeon's ambient drip and sigh. Mark froze, pressing himself against a damp wall. He crept forward, peering around a corner into a larger, torchlit chamber. 3 figures stood near a bubbling underground spring that filled the room with a mineral tang.
They were chosen.
They looked human, but there was an otherness to them. Their gear gleamed with subtle enchantments, a warrior in polished leather armor with glowing pauldrons, a woman in robes that shimmered with arcane symbols, and a third in lighter gear with a bow slung across his back. Floating above each of their heads were translucent, blue-tinted status bars and names: Gareth, level 7 warrior; Ilara, level 6 mage; Finn, level 5 ranger. Mark's own status, when he willed it, appeared in a dull, greenish hue with no such public display. Total waste of time, Gareth was saying, hefting a broadsword.
These goblin dungeons barely give any XP at our level. We should be pushing into the Whispering Woods.
Ilara sighed, adjusting her robes. Kale's orders, Gareth. He wants all the local dungeons cleared before the raid on Sunhaven. Says it'll destabilize the region's monster spawns, make the village easier to pacify.
Mark's ears pricked. Sunhaven. Raid.
Finn, the ranger, crouched by the spring, filling a water skin.
Pacify. That's a nice word for it. Enslaving a whole village for their farmland and artisan quarter.
Seems harsh, even for Kale. Don't let him hear you say that, Gareth grunted. He's got the system's favor, or thinks he does. Says it's for the greater good, consolidating resources for the chosen expansion.
Besides, they're just NPCs. They reset after a while, don't they?
The villagers don't respawn, Gareth, Ilara said quietly.
They're native to this world. They die for real. Like the mobs. Same difference. They're not chosen. They don't matter in the grand scheme.
Gareth shrugged. We get the quest rewards, the reputation with Kale's faction.
That's what matters.
Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dungeon air. They spoke of enslavement and death with such casual detachment. He was a mob, beneath their notice. So were the villagers of Sunhaven. The moral lines of this world were stark and brutal. He stayed perfectly still, listening as they discussed raid timetables, the village's defenses, pathetic, according to Gareth, and a key quest item of vitality crystal needed to complete the enslavement ritual. They planned to retrieve it from a deeper part of this very dungeon after clearing the boss. Speaking of which, Finn said, standing. We've cleared the trash mobs. The boss chamber is just past that archway. Let's get this over with. The group moved off, their footsteps fading. Mark waited until the silence returned, then slipped from his hiding place. His mind raced. Sun Haven. Enslavement. He had no power, no strength. But he was unseen. An idea, fragile and terrifying, began to form. If he could not fight, perhaps he could interfere. He followed the path the Chosen had taken, passing through the archway they'd indicated. The corridor beyond opened into a vast, cavernous space. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone teeth. At the far end, on a raised dais, slept the boss, a massive, hulking creature that resembled a cross between a troll and a bear, covered in shaggy, mossy fur. It was easily 15 feet tall, its chest rising and falling in slow, rumbling breaths. Grok the Mossback, level 10 dungeon boss. Nearby, the three Chosen were engaged with a few remaining lesser goblins, their blades and spells flashing in the gloom. Mark's eyes were drawn not to the fight, but to the side of the chamber. There, partly obscured by a fallen stalagmite, was a small, ornate treasure chest. It was different from the others, carved from dark wood with silver inlay, glowing with a soft, golden light. The boss slept mere yards away. The Chosen were distracted. This was it. He moved, his heart in his throat. Every footstep felt thunderous, though only the soft scuff of skin on stone reached his own ears. He skirted the edge of the chamber, keeping to the shadows. The air grew colder near the dais. The smell of the boss, wet earth, old meat, and a pungent, fungal odor was overwhelming. He reached the chest. It was unlocked. He lifted the lid, the hinges silent. Inside, on a bed of velvet, lay several items, a bag of gold coins, a scroll case, and a single, crystalline vial filled with a liquid that shimmered with a soft, internal light. Potion of Greater Healing, rare, restores 50 HP. This was significant loot. His hands trembled as he took the vial. It was cool, the glass smooth. He pocketed the gold and the scroll case as well, his movements hurried, furtive. He glanced at the boss. Grok the Mossback slept on, a low growl rumbling in its throat. The Chosen had dispatched the last goblin and were now discussing strategy for the boss fight, their voices hushed. Mark began to back away, his eyes fixed on the boss. One step, then another. His foot came down on a loose piece of rubble, a small, sharp stone he hadn't seen. It skittered across the floor with a loud, grating clack. The sound echoed in the cavernous space. Time seemed to freeze. The Chosen fell silent, turning toward the noise. Grok the Mossback's rumbling snore hitched. One massive, moss-covered eyelid twitched. The boss stirred, its head lifting slightly from the dais. A deep, questioning grunt vibrated through the chamber. Mark stood frozen, the stolen potion heavy in his pouch, directly in the creature's line of sight. The boss's gaze, bleary and half asleep, swept over the area where he stood. It sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. Mark could see every detail of its coarse fur, the yellowed tusks, the intelligence in its deep-set eyes. This was it. The test. Would absolute neutrality hold against a direct, provoked disturbance? Grok's eyes passed over him. They lingered for a moment on the spot, then moved on, scanning the chamber. The boss grunted again, a sound of mild annoyance, and lowered its head back to the stone with a heavy thud. The rumbling snore resumed. The Chosen relaxed. Just dungeon settling, Finn muttered. Let's buff up and engage, Gareth said, hefting his sword. Mark didn't wait. He turned and fled, moving as quickly and quietly as he could back the way he had come, the stolen treasures a burning weight against his side. He didn't stop until he was back in the empty corridor near the entrance, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it. He had looted a treasure room right under a boss's nose. The potion of greater healing felt like a lifeline, a tangible symbol of his strange, powerless power.
But the conversation he'd overheard echoed louder. Sun Haven. Enslavement.
He was a ghost in this world, but he had just stolen from a boss.
What else could a ghost do? The chapter closed with him standing in the dim tunnel, the distant sounds of the Chosen engaging Grok the Mossback faint behind him, the weight of his loot and newfound knowledge pressing down, the first seeds of a dangerous choice taking root in the shadowed soil of his mind. The silence in the dungeon corridor was absolute, broken only by the distant drip of water and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Grok the Mossback returning to slumber. Mark stood frozen, the stolen potion of greater healing clutched so tightly in his greenskin hand that his knuckles ached. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to wake the dead or at least a sleeping dungeon boss. But Grok didn't stir again.
The massive, moss-covered creature, part bear, part turtle, all nightmare, merely shifted in its nest of bones and treasure, one milky eye sliding shut as it settled back into dreams of carnage.
Mark's breath escaped in a shaky exhale he hadn't realized he was holding.
The confirmation was as terrifying as it was liberating. Absolute neutrality worked. Even when he made noise, even when he was right there, the boss's aggression remained at zero. He was a ghost in this world, invisible to the very systems designed to detect threats. Slowly, carefully, Mark backed away from the chamber. His goblin feet, small, clawed, and surprisingly nimble, made no sound on the damp stone. He kept his eyes locked on Grok until he rounded the corner, then broke into a silent run, the potion bottle bouncing against his crude leather pouch. The dungeon's winding passages blurred past, familiar now after his careful exploration. He passed other monsters, a pack of skittering cave spiders, a lone skeletal warrior clanking through a side tunnel, but none so much as glanced in his direction.
To them, he was less than air.
It should have felt empowering. Instead, a cold dread settled in Mark's stomach. The journal he'd found earlier replayed in his mind, Chosen could respawn.
Mobs like him died permanently.
And now he knew Kale's plan, Sunhaven Village, enslaved for resources, all for a vitality crystal from this very dungeon. He had the healing potion, a rare treasure that glowed with soft golden light, but what good was loot if the world burned around him? He emerged from the cleft of Grok into late afternoon sunlight, blinking against the sudden glare. The entrance was hidden in a rocky outcrop at the edge of the Whispering Woods, a place of gnarled trees and shifting shadows. Mark paused, scanning the area. No Chosen in sight. Gareth, Ilara, and Finn must have moved on, perhaps to report to Kale or continue their preparations.
Good. He needed time to think.
His goblin body was lean and wiry, built for stealth rather than strength. Level 1 Goblin Scout, his status screen had declared, with pathetic stats except for that one broken trait. He could feel the fatigue in his muscles, the hunger gnawing at his belly. Surviving in this world meant more than avoiding fights, it meant finding food, shelter, safety.
The potion was valuable, but he couldn't drink it yet, not for mere hunger.
It was a lifeline, to be saved for true desperation.
Mark moved into the woods, sticking to the shadows.
The forest was alive with sounds, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the distant growl of some predator. But nothing attacked him. A wolf with matted fur and hungry eyes padded past, close enough to touch, and didn't even sniff in his direction. Mark's pulse spiked, but he forced himself to walk calmly. This was his reality now, perpetual invisibility to hostility. He could walk through a den of monsters and emerge unscathed, provided he didn't physically bump into them. For hours, he trekked deeper into the wilderness, following a faint game trail. He foraged where he could, a handful of bitter berries, some edible fungi he recognized from his old world's gaming knowledge. It wasn't much, but it staved off the worst of the hunger. As dusk began to paint the sky in shades of purple and orange, he found a small stream and drank deeply, the cool water soothing his parched throat. It was there, by the water's edge, that he heard it, a soft, pained whimper. Mark froze, ears twitching. The sound came from a thicket of brambles a few yards away. Cautiously, he approached, parting the thorny branches with careful hands. Inside lay a young forest deer, its leg trapped in a rusted iron snare. The animal struggled weakly, eyes wide with terror, blood matting its brown fur around the cruel metal teeth. It was a pitiful sight, a creature of grace brought low by some forgotten trap, probably set by chosen hunters long gone.
Mark's first instinct was to walk away. What did it matter?
He was a goblin, a mob, a thing meant to be killed for experience points. Helping this deer wouldn't gain him levels or loot.
It might even draw attention if he made noise.
But as he watched the deer's sides heave with panicked breaths, something twisted in his chest. This wasn't a monster programmed to attack, it was just an animal, suffering.
And he could do something about it.
He knelt beside the deer, ignoring the way it flinched.
"Easy," he murmured, though he knew it couldn't understand.
His goblin voice was rough and guttural, but he tried to keep it soft. The snare was old, the mechanism stiff with rust. Mark worked at it, his small fingers struggling to pry the jaws apart. The deer kicked once, a feeble thrash, and Mark hissed as a thorn scraped his arm. But he didn't stop. He braced his foot against the ground and pulled, muscles straining. With a final, grating screech, the snare sprang open. The deer jerked free, stumbling to its feet. For a moment, it stood trembling, eyes locked on Mark. Then, with a burst of energy, it bounded away into the woods, leaving only a few drops of blood and the broken trap behind.
Mark sat back on his heels, breathing heavily.
His arms ached, and the scratch on his arm stung. But a strange warmth spread through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since waking in this world. He had helped. He had changed something. No experience points, no system notification, just the quiet satisfaction of a good deed.
But with it came a chilling realization: his actions had consequences. If he could free a deer, what else could he do?
He could steal treasures, yes, but he could also intervene in larger events. Like Kale's raid on Sunhaven. The moral weight settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. He could remain a ghost, safe and unseen, letting atrocities unfold around him. Or he could use his invisibility to interfere, to sabotage, to protect. The latter was dangerous, it risked exposure, attention from the system, maybe even death. But after helping the deer, the idea of doing nothing felt wrong. He stood, brushing dirt from his ragged clothes. The potion of greater healing seemed to glow brighter in his pouch, a reminder of what he could acquire from the shadows. But it was the deer's freedom that lingered in his mind. He took a deep breath, the forest air cool and clean. Time to move. He needed to understand this world better, to see what he was up against.
Mark climbed a nearby hill, using his goblin agility to scramble up rocks and roots.
As he reached the summit, the trees thinned, revealing a vast valley below. And there, spread out like some grotesque painting, was a battlefield. It stretched for miles, a chaotic tapestry of violence. Hundreds, no, thousands, of figures clashed under the darkening sky. On one side, chosen in gleaming armor and colorful robes, their spells lighting up the dusk with flashes of fire and ice. On the other, hordes of monsters, orcs with crude axes, giant spiders skittering through the ranks, winged creatures diving from above. The air thrummed with the sounds of combat, clashing steel, war cries, agonized screams. Explosions rocked the ground, sending plumes of dirt and debris into the air. Mark's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a skirmish, it was an apocalypse. He saw a chosen warrior cut down 3 goblins with a single swing, their bodies dissolving into motes of light. He saw a mage summon a meteor that cratered the earth, obliterating a pack of wolves. He saw monsters tearing into chosen, blood spraying, but the chosen seemed to fight with reckless abandon, knowing they could respawn. It was a farm, a grinding of experience points, and the mobs were the crops.
And he was one of them.
A level 1 Goblin Scout, utterly insignificant in this sea of death. But as he watched, he noticed something: none of the combatants looked his way. Even as a spell detonated uncomfortably close to his hill, sending a shower of rocks past him, no one turned.
He was outside the conflict, an unseen witness.
His mind raced. This battlefield was between 2 factions, chosen and monsters, but Kale's plan targeted something else, a peaceful village.
Sunhaven. Were the villagers down there somewhere, caught in the crossfire? Or was this a distraction, a way for Kale to draw attention while he moved on Sunhaven?
Mark didn't know, but the scale of the violence hardened his resolve. If this was the world the Chosen had built, then his ghostly existence might be the only way to change it. He crouched low,
watching as the battle raged on. A group of chosen broke through the monster lines, led by a figure in black armor who moved with terrifying efficiency. Kale? Mark couldn't be sure from this distance. But he saw the aftermath, mobs slaughtered, chosen laughing as they looted corpses. It was brutal, senseless, and it made his stomach churn. The deer's whimper echoed in his memory. He had helped one small creature. Could he help a village? Could he stop Kale? As night fully descended, the battlefield began to glow with magical lights and burning wreckage. Mark stayed on the hill, a silent silhouette against the starry sky. He had escaped the dungeon with loot, survived the wilderness, and learned that his actions mattered. Now, he faced a world at war, and he was the only one who could walk through it unseen. The path ahead was dangerous, but for the first time, he felt a purpose beyond mere survival. He would go to Sunhaven. He would see what he could do. And he would start by crossing that battlefield, a ghost among the dead and dying, to reach the village before Kale did. The potion in his pouch felt heavier now, not just a treasure, but a tool. And his zero aggro wasn't just a curse, it was a weapon. Mark took a step forward, then another, descending the hill toward the carnage. The sounds of battle grew louder, the smells of blood and ozone thick in the air. He didn't run. He walked, steady and sure, into the heart of the chaos, invisible to all, but seeing everything. The battlefield stretched before Mark like a canvas of carnage, painted in shades of blood and steel. From the hilltop, it had been an abstract spectacle, flashes of magic, distant roars, the faint clash of weapons. But now, as he descended into its heart, the reality of it all pressed against his senses with visceral weight. He moved through the chaos like a ghost, his goblin feet padding silently on churned earth. To his left, a pack of wolf-like creatures with obsidian hides, Shadowfawn words, level 15, his status screen helpfully supplied, tore into a group of chosen clad in leather armor. The chosen fought with practiced efficiency, their swords glowing with enchantments that left afterimages in the air. One of them, a woman with fiery red hair, shouted commands in a language Mark didn't recognize, her voice cutting through the din flank left. "Don't let them surround you." Mark paused, watching as a word lunged at her. She parried with a shimmering shield of light, then drove her blade into its throat. The creature dissolved into motes of dark energy, leaving behind a few copper coins and a tattered pelt. The chosen didn't even glance at the loot, they were already moving to the next cluster of monsters. It was efficient, brutal, and utterly impersonal. These weren't battles for survival or honor, they were farming sessions. Experience points and loot drops. Mark's stomach twisted as he realized the truth. The mobs here, creatures like the Wurgs or the occasional rock troll, level 20, he saw being pummeled by mages, were nothing more than resources to be harvested. They spawned, they fought, they died, and the chosen grew stronger from their deaths. He kept walking, his absolute neutrality wrapping around him like an invisible cloak. A flaming arrow shot past his head, close enough that he felt the heat on his green skin, but the archer who'd fired it, a chosen with intricate tattoos covering his arms, didn't so much as blink in his direction. The arrow struck a goblin shaman, level 12, 20 feet away, igniting it in a burst of magical fire. The shaman screeched, flailing before collapsing into ash. Mark flinched, a cold knot forming in his chest. That could have been him. Would have been him, if not for the glitch in his stats. He moved deeper, skirting around a skirmish where a dozen chosen were systematically dismantling a stone golem, level 25. Spells of frost and lightning crackled through the air, chipping away at the golem's rocky form. One of the chosen, a burly man with a two-handed axe, laughed as he landed a critical hit. Almost got it. Save the last hit for Kale, he needs the XP for his next rank. Kale. The name snagged in Mark's mind, pulling him from his morbid observations. He remembered the conversation he'd overheard in the dungeon, the plan to raid a village called Sunhaven. Was this the same Kale? He edged closer, using the cover of a shattered cart to listen. The axe wielder continued, his voice booming over the sounds of combat. Kale said once we're done here, we're heading to that village up north. Sunhaven, I think it's called. Place is supposed to be rich in luminous crystals. Perfect for enchanting gear. Another chosen, a slender woman with dual daggers, wiped blood from her blade. And the villagers? Kale's plan still to enslave them for labor?
Seems harsh, even for us. The burly man shrugged, hefting his axe for another swing at the golem.
Harsh? This is a hardcore world, Lena. Resources are everything. If they're not strong enough to defend their home, they don't deserve to keep it. Kale's just being practical. Besides, the system rewards efficiency. Enslaving them nets a steady resource income without constant raids.
Mark's hands clenched into fists at his sides.
Practical. Efficient.
The words were like ice in his veins. He thought of the wounded deer he'd freed, how its eyes had held a spark of something beyond mere programming.
Were the villagers of Sunhaven any different? Just because they weren't chosen, didn't have respawns or player menus, did that make them expendable?
He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost didn't notice the golem's final moments. With a grinding roar, it collapsed, shattering into rubble. The chosen cheered, gathering around as a figure stepped forward from their ranks.
This had to be Kale.
He was tall, clad in polished plate armor that gleamed even under the overcast sky. A crimson cloak flowed from his shoulders, and he carried a sword that seemed to drink the light around it, a blade of voracious shadow, epic quality. His face was sharp, all angles and cold calculation, with eyes that scanned the battlefield like a merchant assessing inventory. He didn't smile as he approached the golem's remains, his expression was one of detached satisfaction. "Good work," Kale said, his voice calm and carrying. He knelt, retrieving a large, crystalline core from the rubble, the golem heart, rare material. "This will fetch a nice price on the market.
Now, listen up. We're moving out in 10 minutes.
I want everyone stocked up on potions and repairs. Sunhaven awaits, and I intend to claim it before any other guild gets ideas." Lena, the dagger wielder, shifted uncomfortably.
"Kale, are we sure about this?
Enslaving a whole village, it could draw attention from the system moderators.
Or worse, other chosen might see us as tyrants."
Kale stood, tucking the heart into a pouch at his belt. His gaze swept over his followers, and Mark felt a chill despite the distance.
"Let them.
The system favors strength, Lena.
Always has. If other chosen object, they can try to stop us. But they won't. Because they'll see the efficiency of our methods. Sunhaven has resources we need, and its people are weak. This isn't tyranny, it's optimization.
We'll put them to work mining the crystals, and in return, we'll protect them from the monsters that would otherwise overrun them.
It's a symbiotic relationship." Symbiotic.
The word tasted like ash in Mark's mind. He'd seen enough of this world to know what protection meant in Kale's vocabulary, subjugation wrapped in pretty lies. The moral conflict that had been simmering since he freed the deer now boiled over.
He could walk away.
He could vanish into the wilderness, loot dungeons, live a life of perfect safety thanks to his zero aggro.
No one would ever know he was here. No one would ever blame him for not acting. But the image of Sunhaven, a peaceful village, unaware of the storm about to break over it, lingered in his thoughts. He remembered the deer's grateful nuzzle, the way it had bounded off into the trees, alive because of a small act of kindness. Was that all he was capable of? Small acts? Or could he do something more?
Kale was already issuing orders, his voice cutting through Mark's internal debate.
"Scouts, move ahead and map the route to Sunhaven.
Healers, make sure everyone is at full health.
We march in 10.
I want that village under our control by nightfall." The chosen began to disperse, some heading to a makeshift camp at the edge of the battlefield where merchants had set up stalls. Mark watched them, his mind racing. If he intervened, he'd be risking everything.
His invisibility wasn't perfect, it only worked as long as he wasn't physically touched or did something blatantly aggressive. Sabotaging Kale's plans would mean stepping into the light, however faintly. He could be detected.
He could die, permanently, with no respawns to save him.
But if he did nothing, Sunhaven would fall.
People, real people, with lives and families, even if they were just NPCs in this game-like world, would be enslaved.
Mark thought of his own rebirth, waking up in that cave as a goblin, terrified and alone.
He'd been given a chance, however strange. Did he owe these villagers less? He took a deep breath, the scent of ozone and blood filling his lungs. The decision crystallized in his mind, sharp and clear. He couldn't just watch. Not this time. As Kale turned to speak with his lieutenants, Mark began to move, not away from the battlefield, but toward the chosen leader. He kept low, using the debris and corpses as cover. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence of his own invisibility. He was a level 1 Goblin Scout, armed with nothing but a rusty dagger and a stolen healing potion, tailing a group of high-level chosen led by a man who saw the world as a spreadsheet to be optimized. It was madness. But it was his madness. He fell into step behind Kale's group, maintaining a distance of about 50 feet. They were moving with purpose now, leaving the battlefield behind, heading north along a dirt road that wound through rocky hills. Mark matched their pace, his goblin body surprisingly agile. He focused on staying silent, on blending into the landscape. Every rustle of grass, every crunch of gravel under his feet felt deafening, but the chosen ahead showed no sign of noticing him. Kale walked at the front, his cloak billowing slightly in the breeze. He was speaking to a lieutenant, a man with a scar across his cheek. And once we have the village, we'll set up a perimeter. I want those crystals mined day and night. The system quest for enslaving Sunhaven should net us enough reputation to unlock the next tier of guild rewards. This is just the beginning. Mark listened, storing every detail. The route, the timing, the objectives. He was no hero, he couldn't fight them head on. But maybe, just maybe, he could be a thorn in their side. A ghost in the machine, disrupting their carefully laid plans. The chapter ended with Mark following Kale's group into the gathering dusk, a small, green shadow trailing the crimson cloak, his resolve hardening with every step. He was unseen, unheard, and utterly determined to change the fate of Sunhaven, no matter the cost. The camp sprawled before Mark like a cancerous growth upon the landscape. Tents of rough-spun canvas and leather, dyed in the muted greens and browns of practical camouflage, clustered around a central fire pit where embers glowed like dying eyes. Torches on poles cast flickering pools of light that did little to dispel the deep shadows between the shelters. The air carried the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and the underlying tang of unwashed bodies and oiled steel. Mark crouched behind a thicket of brambles 50 yards from the perimeter, his goblin heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had followed Kale's group for hours, moving with the silent, unhurried pace his condition allowed. The chosen had marched with the confident swagger of predators, their armor clinking, their voices loud with boasts and crude jokes. Mark had hung back, a ghost in their wake, his small green form blending into the undergrowth. Now, as dusk deepened into night, the camp was a hive of activity. Guards patrolled in pairs, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond the torchlight. Figures moved between tents, their shadows stretching long and grotesque. This is insane, Mark thought, his fingers digging into the cool soil. I'm a level 1 Goblin Scout. One touch, one misstep, and I'm dead. Permanently, But the memory of Kale's voice, cold and calculating as he discussed the enslavement of Sunhaven, burned in his mind. Practical efficiency, he'd called it. Mark had seen the chosen slaughter mobs on the battlefield with detached efficiency. They were players in a game, and the villagers of Sunhaven were about to become NPCs in their brutal narrative. The moral conflict that had churned within him since he awoke in this world crystallized into a hard, sharp resolve. He could not stand by. His invisibility was not just a curse for survival, it was a tool. Perhaps the only tool that could make a difference. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Mark focused on his trait. Absolute neutrality. Aggro permanently 0. To the monsters, to the bosses, to the hostile chosen, he was beneath notice, a pebble on the path, a leaf in the wind. Unless he physically touched them, their perceptions simply slid off him. He had tested it in the dungeon, with the sleeping boss. He had walked through the battlefield unscathed. Now, he would test it in the heart of the enemy camp. He waited for a patrol to pass, 2 armored chosen, a human with a broadsword and an elf with a bow, their conversation a low murmur about loot drops and experience points. As they moved away, Mark slipped from the brambles. He moved not with stealth born of skill, but with the utter mundanity of his existence. He did not try to hide, he simply walked, his small feet making faint rustles in the grass that were lost in the night sounds of insects and the crackle of the central fire. He passed within 10 feet of a guard leaning on a spear, yawning. The man's gaze swept over him without pause, without recognition. Mark's breath caught, but he forced himself to keep moving, his steps steady. It works. It really works. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. He was a ghost in a world of the living. The camp was organized with military precision. Larger tents, likely for officers, stood near the center. Mark made his way toward one that seemed more substantial than the others, its canvas stamped with a symbol he didn't recognize, a stylized fist gripping a lightning bolt. Voices drifted from within, sharp and commanding. "Deploy at dawn," Kale's voice, unmistakable in its cold authority. "The village has no walls to speak of. We'll hit them hard and fast. Round up the able-bodied first. The elders and children can be dealt with afterward, they're less valuable but good for intimidation if any resist." Mark's stomach twisted. He edged closer, pressing himself against the rough canvas of the tent. Through a gap in the seam, he could see shadows moving inside. Kale stood over a makeshift table, a map spread before him. He was a tall human, his armor dark and ornate, his face sharp and cruel under a helm of black iron. 2 other chosen flanked him, a hulking brute with a spiked mace and a slender woman in mage's robes, her fingers tracing lines on the map. "The ritual site is here," the mage said, her voice a sibilant whisper. "At the old stone circle north of the village. We'll need the orb of subjugation to activate it. Without it, the enslavement bonds won't hold." "The orb is secure?" Kale asked. "In my tent, under guard," the brute grunted. "But the map shows the best approaches. We don't want them scattering into the woods." Mark's eyes fixed on the map. It was detailed, showing Sunhaven's layout, the surrounding forest, and the stone circle. If he could steal it, it might delay them, confuse them. Every moment counted for the villagers. He waited, his body tense, as the meeting continued. They discussed numbers, tactics, the distribution of loot. Mark absorbed it all, his mind filing away details. The orb was key. The ritual was at the stone circle. They planned to strike at dawn. After what felt like an eternity, the meeting broke up. Kale and the mage left the tent, heading toward the fire. The brute lingered for a moment, rolling up the map and tucking it into a leather tube before stepping out. Mark watched as the man strode to a smaller tent nearby, ducked inside, and emerged without the tube. A guard took up position outside the tent, arms crossed. That's where the map is, Mark thought. And probably other plans. He waited until the camp's activity settled into a slower rhythm. The deep night hours approached. Guards still patrolled, but their steps were slower, their vigilance dulled by fatigue. Mark moved again, weaving between tents with his unnatural unobtrusiveness. He passed a group of chosen playing dice by a lantern, their laughter loud. One of them, a dwarf with a braided beard, glanced in his direction as Mark skirted the edge of their light. For a heart-stopping second, Mark froze. But the dwarf's eyes didn't focus, he simply scratched his beard and returned to the game. "They can't see me," Mark reminded himself, but the close calls were wearing on his nerves. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide. He pushed it down. He reached the tent where the brute had stored the map. The guard outside was a human, leaning against a tent pole, his head nodding. Mark approached slowly, directly. The guard's eyes were half closed. Mark stepped around him, his shoulder brushing the man's armored leg. The guard jerked awake, his hand going to his sword hilt. He looked down, right at the spot where Mark stood. Mark held his breath, his body rigid. The guard frowned, rubbed his eyes, and muttered, "Must have been a rat." He settled back, his vigilance lapsing once more. Mark let out a silent exhale. That had been too close. Physical contact didn't break his trait, the guard still hadn't perceived him as a threat, but it risked alerting them to something amiss. He ducked into the tent. Inside, it was dark and cluttered. A bedroll lay in one corner, a chest at the foot. Weapons and pieces of armor were stacked haphazardly.
On a small stool sat the leather tube. Mark's goblin hands, small and clever, snatched it up.
He unrolled the map quickly, confirming it was the one from Kale's meeting.
It showed Sunhaven in damning detail.
He rolled it back up, but as he did, his eyes caught something else, a sheaf of papers tucked under the chest.
He pulled them out.
Lists of names, inventory of supplies, a crude drawing of the orb of subjugation.
Intelligence.
He took those too, stuffing them into a makeshift pouch he'd fashioned from a scrap of cloth. He was about to leave when he heard voices approaching outside.
Two chosen, their conversation clear. Felt something weird earlier, a female voice said. It was light, curious. Like a presence, but not. My detection skill pinged, but there was nothing there.
Probably just the wind, Lyra, a male voice replied, bored.
Or a low-level mob wandering too close. They're everywhere out here.
No, it was different, Lyra insisted.
It was neutral. Like the system didn't register it as anything at all. That shouldn't be possible. Mark's blood ran cold. Lyra, the name from the outline. She could sense something. He peered through a gap in the tent flap.
The speakers were a young woman with silver hair tied back, wearing light leather armor, and a burly man with an axe at his belt.
Lyra's eyes were sharp, scanning the darkness.
They were walking toward this very tent.
Panic surged. Mark looked around. No other exit.
He crouched behind the chest, making himself as small as possible.
The tent flap opened, and the burly man entered, lighting a small lantern. Lyra followed. See? Nothing, the man said, yawning. You're too jumpy. Lyra didn't answer.
She stood in the center of the tent, her head tilted. Her eyes moved slowly, methodically, over every shadow. Mark held his breath, his heart pounding so loud he was sure they could hear it.
She was looking right at the chest, right at where he hid.
There's a disturbance in the ambient mana, she murmured, more to herself than to her companion.
Faint, but consistent. Like something is here that shouldn't be.
She took a step forward.
Mark could see her boots, scuffed and dusty. He pressed back against the tent wall.
If she touched him, but his trait should hold.
Unless her skill bypassed it somehow.
Lyra, come on, the man said, rummaging through a pack.
We need sleep. Dawn raid tomorrow. In a moment, Lyra said.
Her gaze swept the tent again.
Then, she did something unexpected.
She closed her eyes, and a faint silvery glow emanated from her fingertips.
A skill activation. Mark felt a strange tingling in the air, like static electricity. It passed over him, and for a second, he feared he would be revealed. But nothing happened.
Lyra opened her eyes, a frown creasing her brow.
It's gone now.
Or, it was never really there.
Just a glitch, maybe.
She turned to leave, and Mark allowed himself a sliver of relief. But as she reached the tent flap, she paused. She looked back, not at any specific spot, but in the general direction of where Mark crouched. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to pierce the shadows. They didn't focus on him, he could tell she still didn't see him, but they lingered, as if sensing the space he occupied. There's something here, she whispered, so low Mark almost missed it.
I can't see it, but I know it.
Then, she locked eyes with the emptiness where Mark hid. Not his eyes, for she couldn't perceive them, but with the very air around him. A chilling certainty passed between them, she knew, on some level, that he existed. The hint was there, in the intensity of her gaze, in the way her body tensed as if ready to spring at a ghost.
For a long moment, they stayed like that, Mark frozen in his hiding place, Lyra staring into the dark.
Then, with a final, thoughtful glance, she turned and left the tent, pulling the flap closed behind her.
Mark remained crouched for several minutes, trembling.
The encounter had shaken him to his core. For the first time, someone had come close to piercing his invisibility.
Lyra was dangerous. But she was also a potential clue. If she could sense him, perhaps others could too. The system AI? The rogue deity mentioned in the outline? Gathering his stolen goods, Mark slipped out of the tent. The guard outside was dozing again. Mark moved quickly now, urgency driving him. He had the map, the papers. He needed to get to Sunhaven, to warn them, to prepare. As he melted into the darkness beyond the camp, he cast one last look back. Lyra stood by the central fire, her silver hair catching the light, her eyes still scanning the night. She didn't look in his direction, but he felt her awareness like a cold touch on his neck. He had infiltrated the camp. He had stolen the key to their plans. But he was no longer entirely unseen. And that changed everything. The night air was cold against Mark's green skin as he fled Kale's camp, the stolen map and documents clutched tightly in his trembling hands. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from exertion. His Goblin Scout body was surprisingly agile, but from the lingering terror of Lyra's gaze. Those sharp, perceptive eyes had seemed to pierce right through his absolute neutrality, locking onto the space he occupied with unnerving certainty. For the first time since awakening in this brutal world, Mark felt visible, and the sensation was a cold knife in his gut. He ran through the dense forest, the moonlight filtering through the canopy in pale, shifting patterns. Twigs snapped underfoot, but no monsters stirred. A pack of shadow wolves, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark, padded past him without so much as a sniff. His aggro stat, eternally 0, held true. Yet Lyra's detection haunted him. Was it a fluke? A unique skill, as he'd feared? The thought gnawed at him, a constant whisper of vulnerability in a world where being unseen was his only shield. After an hour of frantic travel, the trees thinned, and the village of Sunhaven came into view. Nestled in a gentle valley, it was a cluster of thatched-roof cottages surrounded by fields of golden wheat, now silvered by moonlight. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the distant sound of a lute drifted on the breeze. It looked peaceful, idyllic, a stark contrast to the militarized camp he'd just escaped. Mark's breath caught. These people had no idea what was coming at dawn. Kale's plans, detailed in the stolen documents, were brutal: a raid to enslave the villagers using an orb of subjugation, a quest item that would bind them to forced labor in the nearby mines. The ritual required the orb to be placed in the village square at sunrise, channeling energy from a dungeon core Kale had secured. Mark crouched behind a large oak tree at the village outskirts, his mind racing. He couldn't just walk in and warn them. As a level 1 Goblin Scout, he'd be attacked on sight not by monsters, but by the villagers themselves, who'd see him as a hostile mob. His absolute neutrality didn't protect him from direct aggression if he provoked it. And even if he tried to speak, his garbled goblin tongue would likely be unintelligible. No, he had to be subtle. He had to use his invisibility to the system's aggression as a tool for influence. He waited until the village quieted, the lute music fading into the deep of night. Slipping from shadow to shadow, he moved through the sleeping streets. His small stature and green skin blended with the darkness, but it was his trait that made him truly ghost-like. A night watchman patrolled the perimeter, his lantern swinging, but his eyes passed over Mark as if he were part of the scenery. Mark's pulse steadied slightly. At least here, among non-chosen, his ability held firm. He needed to warn them without revealing himself. The stolen documents included a list of village elders, names like Ilara, the healer, and Borin, the blacksmith. Mark decided to target them. In the quiet of the pre-dawn hours, he crept to Ilara's cottage first. The door was unlocked, a testament to the village's trust, and he slipped inside. The air smelled of herbs and dried flowers. Ilara, an elderly woman with silver hair, slept soundly in a corner bed. Mark's hands shook as he pulled a piece of parchment from his inventory, looted from a dungeon chest days ago, and a charcoal stick. He wrote in clumsy, blocky letters, his goblin fingers unaccustomed to the task. Kale comes at dawn. Orb of subjugation in square. Flee or hide. From a friend. He placed it on her bedside table, weighing it down with a small stone. Then, he repeated the process at Borin's forge, leaving a note on his anvil. He hit 3 more homes, each time feeling a mix of guilt and determination. He was a ghost, whispering warnings into the void, hoping they'd be heeded. As he left the last note, he paused by the village well, listening.
The wind carried murmurs, someone had found a note, and hushed conversations began to stir.
Good. Let them be unsettled. Let them prepare. But warning wasn't enough. Kale's raid would proceed regardless if the orb ritual completed. Mark needed to sabotage it directly.
According to the documents, the orb of subjugation was a glowing, crystalline sphere that Kale's lieutenant, a hulking chosen named Garrick, would carry. It had to be placed in the village square at sunrise to activate the enslavement magic. If Mark could steal it before then, the ritual would fail. But doing so meant getting close to Garrick, a high-level chosen who, unlike Lyra, shouldn't be able to perceive him unless Kale had more detection skills up his sleeve.
Mark spent the remaining dark hours preparing.
He scouted the village square, a cobblestone area with a central fountain. He noted potential hiding spots, behind the fountain, in the shadows of the tavern's eaves, even among the stacked crates near the market stalls. His goblin eyes, adapted for low light, picked out every detail. He also studied the stolen map, which showed Kale's planned approach route from the east. Mark decided to position himself there, hidden in plain sight among the raiding party when they arrived.
With his trait, he could walk right beside them, unseen as a threat. As the first hints of pink tinged the horizon, Mark's anxiety spiked.
He crouched behind a haycart near the eastern road, clutching a small dagger he'd looted earlier, more for psychological comfort than actual use. The village was awakening, but uneasily. He saw Alara and Boren speaking in hushed tones by the well, glancing around nervously.
A few villagers began packing belongings, while others sharpened farm tools, their faces set in grim determination.
His notes had done their work, but it was a fragile defense against chosen might.
Then, he heard it, the distant tramp of boots, the clank of armor. Kale's forces were approaching. Mark's breath hitched.
He peered from behind the cart. A column of chosen emerged from the tree line, about 20 strong, led by Kale himself, a tall man in polished plate armor, his face stern under a helm. Beside him walked Garrick, a brute of a man with a two-handed axe slung across his back. In Garrick's hands, cradled like a precious egg, was the orb of subjugation. It glowed with a sickly green light, pulsing faintly in the dawn gloom.
Mark's eyes locked on the orb. That was his target. He waited, forcing himself to be still.
As the raiders marched into the village square, the villagers backed away, forming a tense semicircle. Kale raised a hand, and his forces fanned out, surrounding the square.
Mark saw his chance.
With his heart in his throat, he slipped from behind the cart and fell into step beside a chosen archer at the rear of the group. The archer didn't flinch, his aggro didn't register Mark's presence. Mark moved silently, his bare feet making no sound on the cobblestones. He was just another part of the scenery, a level 1 Goblin Scout utterly beneath notice. He edged closer to Garrick, who stood near the fountain, holding the orb aloft. Kale began to speak, his voice booming across the square.
People of Sunhaven.
By the authority of the system and the will of the chosen, you are hereby conscripted for resource extraction.
Resist, and you will be broken.
Murmurs of fear rippled through the villagers.
Mark ignored them, focusing on Garrick.
The lieutenant placed the orb on the fountain's edge, beginning to chant words of power from a scroll. The orb's glow intensified, casting eerie shadows. This was it. Mark had to act now, before the ritual completed. He crept forward, his small body weaving between chosen legs. He was close enough to touch Garrick's boot. The orb was just inches away, pulsing with malevolent energy. Mark reached out, his fingers trembling. But as he did, a voice cut through the chant. Hold! It was Lyra. She stepped from the ranks, her eyes scanning the crowd. Mark froze, his hand hovering near the orb.
Had she seen him?
No, her gaze swept past, but it lingered near his position. She addressed Kale.
Sir, I sense an anomaly.
The system logs show irregular energy readings in this area.
Something is interfering.
Kale frowned.
What kind of anomaly? Unknown. But it's centered here. I recommend delaying the ritual until we investigate. Mark's mind raced. Lyra was covering for him or testing him? He couldn't tell. But her intervention bought him seconds. As Kale debated, Mark made his move.
In one swift motion, he snatched the orb of subjugation from the fountain's edge. It was heavier than he expected, cold and vibrating in his hands. The glow flickered, and Garrick's chant faltered.
"What in the?" Garrick roared, looking down at the empty spot where the orb had been. Chaos erupted.
Kale shouted orders.
"Find it. It can't have just vanished."
Chosen began searching, but their eyes passed over Mark as he clutched the orb to his chest, backing away. He was invisible to their aggression, but the physical object in his hands was real. If someone bumped into him, they'd feel it.
He needed to hide.
He ducked behind the fountain, then slipped into the shadow of the tavern. The orb's energy hummed against his skin, a constant reminder of what he'd stolen. He saw Lyra watching the commotion, a faint smile on her lips.
She knew. She had to know.
Kale's forces scoured the square, growing increasingly frustrated. The villagers, sensing an opportunity, began to murmur louder, some edging toward the exits. Kale's plan was unraveling, and Mark was the unseen thread pulling it apart. But as he crouched in the shadows, the orb held tight, he realized the chapter wasn't over. Kale's eyes narrowed, and he barked a new command.
"Lock down the village. No one leaves. Search every building, every crate. That orb is here somewhere, and I will have it."
Mark watched as Chosen spread out, kicking in doors and overturning carts. He was trapped in the square, the orb a glowing beacon in his arms. He had to hide in plain sight again, but this time, with the entire raiding party on high alert.
He took a deep breath, steeling himself.
As a group of Chosen marched past, he fell into step beside them, the orb tucked under his arm like a mundane package.
They didn't see him. They couldn't. But for how long?
The chapter ended with Mark moving silently among Kale's forces, the orb's fate and his own hanging in the balance, hidden in plain sight but perilously close to exposure. The orb of subjugation felt unnaturally cold in Mark's three-fingered goblin hands, a pulsing sphere of violet light that seemed to leach warmth from the very air. He clutched it against his ragged leather tunic, the glow seeping through the fabric like a captured star. Around him, Sunhaven Village had descended into pandemonium.
Kale's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with fury. "Find it." The orb didn't just vanish.
The Chosen leader stood at the center of the village square, his polished plate armor gleaming under the morning sun. His face, usually a mask of arrogant control, was twisted with rage. The ritual circle etched into the packed earth with chalk and powdered silver lay inert, its magical energies dissipated the moment Mark had snatched the orb from Garrick's belt pouch. Mark pressed himself against the rough-hewn wall of a grain storehouse, his heart hammering against his ribs.
The absolute neutrality trait hummed in his awareness, that constant, silent assurance that no monster or hostile entity could perceive him as a threat. But Chosen were different.
They weren't monsters, they were players, humans with free will and perception.
And right now, dozens of them were scouring the village, their eyes scanning every shadow. Search every building. Check every villager.
Kale barked, pointing a gauntlet hand toward the clustered cottages.
"Garrick, you incompetent fool, how did you lose it?"
Garrick, the lieutenant, paled. "It was right there, Commander. One moment it was on my belt, the next." He trailed off, shaking his head.
"It must have been a pickpocket skill."
"One of the villagers? These dirt grubbers don't have those skills," Kale snarled.
This was sabotage. Someone is interfering.
His gaze swept the crowd of terrified villagers, herded into the square by armored Chosen. Then his eyes lingered on the edges of the village, where the forest loomed.
"Lyra. Report."
From the periphery, Lyra stepped forward. Her leather armor was dusted with road grit, and her short sword hung loosely at her hip.
Unlike the other Chosen, her expression was thoughtful rather than angry.
"No tracks leading away, Commander. No magical signatures beyond the ritual residue.
If someone took it, they're still here." Mark held his breath. Lyra's eyes seemed to drift toward his general direction, not quite locking on but lingering near the storehouse wall. Did she sense him?
In the camp, there had been that moment, a flicker of awareness. But now, her gaze moved on, scanning the rooftops. "Then we tear this village apart until we find it," Kale said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm.
"No one leaves. No one hides.
Start with the barns and storage sheds. The orb has a containment field, it can't be teleported or bagged in an inventory. Whoever has it is carrying it physically."
Mark's grip tightened on the orb.
The cold was seeping into his bones now, a deep, aching chill that made his goblin fingers stiff.
He needed to move. Staying in one place was suicide, even invisible.
He edged along the wall, keeping low, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. The orb's glow was a problem, it was faint through the fabric, but in shadowed areas, it might be noticeable. He tucked it deeper into his tunic, the cold pressing against his chest. He slipped around the corner of the storehouse, into a narrow alley between buildings. From here, he could see the main square. Villagers, men, women, even children, were being roughly questioned by chosen guards. An elderly man was shoved to the ground for moving too slowly.
Mark's stomach twisted.
This was his fault. He'd disrupted the ritual, but he hadn't stopped the raid. Kale's forces were still here, and now they were furious. A group of chosen marched past the alley entrance, their boots thudding in unison. Mark froze, pressing into a recessed doorway. One of them, a woman with a scar across her cheek, paused and peered into the alley. Her eyes narrowed.
Mark didn't move, didn't breathe. The absolute neutrality should keep her from registering him as a threat, but if she looked directly at him, if she focused. "Anything?" another chosen called from the street.
The scarred woman shook her head. "Just shadows.
Move on." They passed, and Mark let out a shaky breath. He needed a plan.
The orb was a liability now. He couldn't use it, couldn't sell it, couldn't even abandon it without risking it falling back into Kale's hands.
But carrying it made him a beacon.
He thought of hiding it, burying it, stashing it in a hayloft. But Kale's men would search everywhere. And if they found it, the ritual could be restarted.
No, he had to keep it. At least until he could get it far away from here.
He moved again, darting across the alley to the back of a cottage. From here, he had a view of the village's largest structure, a weathered wooden barn on the eastern edge, used for storing harvests. Its doors were slightly ajar.
It was risky and obvious hiding place.
But sometimes the obvious was overlooked. And it was away from the main square, closer to the forest edge where he might slip away later.
Mark crept toward the barn, keeping to the shadows of fences and outbuildings.
Twice, he had to flatten himself against walls as chosen patrols passed. Each time, his heart raced, the orb's cold a constant reminder of his precarious situation. He could hear snippets of conversation.
"Think it's one of the villagers? No way. They're all level 5 or below. No stealth skills. Could be a rival guild.
Kale will flay whoever it is."
Finally, he reached the barn.
The doors creaked as he pushed one open just enough to slip inside. The interior was dim, lit only by slivers of sunlight through cracks in the walls. The air was thick with the scent of dry hay and old wood. Piles of harvested grain sacks lay stacked against one wall, and rusty farm tools hung from hooks. In the center, a vacant space where livestock might have been kept. Mark sank into a shadowed corner behind a stack of sacks, pulling his knees to his chest. The orb's glow illuminated the fabric of his tunic from within, a soft violet pulse. He wrapped his arms around it, trying to muffle the light. For a moment, he just sat there, listening to the distant sounds of the search, shouts, doors banging, the occasional cry of a villager. His mind raced.
He'd done it.
He'd stolen the orb, disrupted the ritual.
But now what?
He was trapped in a barn, in a village surrounded by hostile chosen. His trait kept him safe from direct aggression, but if they stumbled into him, if they touched him. He remembered the owlbear in the cave, how it had ignored him until he'd brushed against it.
Physical contact broke the illusion.
He thought of Lyra. There was something about her. She hadn't raised the alarm when she'd seemed to sense him.
Was she an ally? Or just biding her time? He couldn't trust anyone.
In this world, he was a level 1 Goblin Scout. To the Chosen, he was expendable, a source of experience points. His only advantage was that they didn't know he existed.
Time passed. The sounds outside grew closer.
He heard footsteps approaching the barn, voices.
Check the barn. Kale wants every structure cleared. Mark's breath caught. He looked around frantically.
The barn had no back door. The only windows were small, high up. He was cornered. The doors swung open with a loud groan, flooding the barn with daylight.
2 Chosen guards stepped inside, their armor clinking.
One carried a torch, though it was daytime, probably for checking dark corners. The other had a sword drawn.
"Hello,"
the torchbearer called, his voice echoing in the empty space.
"Anyone in here?" Mark pressed deeper into the corner, behind the grain sacks. The sacks were coarse burlap, offering little concealment if they looked closely. But they didn't look.
Their eyes scanned the barn, but they didn't focus on his corner. The absolute neutrality was working, they didn't perceive him as a threat, so their attention slid right over him.
"Looks empty," the swordsman said, kicking at a pile of hay. "Just a storage dump." "Check behind those sacks," the torchbearer said, pointing directly at Mark's hiding spot.
Mark's blood ran colder than the orb. He clutched the sphere tighter, the violet light brightening slightly in his panic. The swordsman strode toward the sacks, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. He was 10 feet away. 5. Mark could see the details of his armor, scratches on the breastplate, a dent on the shoulder. The man's face was bored, impatient.
He reached out a hand to shove the top sack aside.
Then, from outside, a shout. "Over here!"
Tracks leading into the forest.
The swordsman paused, his hand hovering. He turned toward the door.
"What?"
The torchbearer hurried to the entrance.
"They found something. Come on."
The swordsman hesitated, glanced once more at the sacks. For a heartbeat, his eyes seemed to look right at Mark.
But there was no recognition, no alarm.
Just the blank gaze of someone scanning an empty space. Then he turned and followed his companion out, pulling the barn doors mostly closed behind him.
Mark slumped against the wall, trembling. That had been too close. The shout about tracks, was that real? Or a diversion? He didn't know.
But it had saved him. He waited, listening. The footsteps faded. But he could still hear activity outside.
The search wasn't over. He was safe for now, but trapped.
The orb pulsed in his hands, a constant, cold weight. He thought about the villagers. He'd warned them, but it hadn't been enough. Kale was still here, and without the ritual, he might resort to brute force.
Mark had to do more. But how? He was one goblin, with 0 aggro and a stolen orb.
A plan began to form, fragile and desperate.
The orb was the key. Kale wanted it for the enslavement ritual. But what if Mark could use it differently?
The orb was magical, powered by something.
Maybe he could disrupt it further, drain its energy, break it.
But that would require time and safety, neither of which he had. He heard more footsteps outside, heavier this time.
Multiple people.
The doors were pushed open again, and this time, 3 Chosen entered. Not guards, higher ranks. Garrick was in the lead, his face grim. Behind him was Lyra, and another Chosen Mark didn't recognize, a burly man with a warhammer.
"Spread out," Garrick ordered. "Kale thinks the thief might have doubled back to hide in the least likely place. Check everything. Lyra, you take the left wall."
Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the barn. She moved toward Mark's side of the space, her steps quiet. Garrick and the warhammer man went to the right, poking at hay piles and lifting tool racks.
Mark held perfectly still. Lyra was getting closer.
She stopped a few feet from his hiding spot, looking at the grain sacks.
Her gaze was intent, thoughtful.
She reached out, not to move the sacks, but to run a hand along the wall behind them, as if feeling for something. Her fingers brushed the air inches from Mark's shoulder. He could smell the leather of her armor, see the faint scar on her jawline. She paused, her head tilting slightly. Then she turned, looking back toward the doors. "Garrick," she said, her voice calm. "There's nothing here. Just old storage. The tracks outside are more promising." Garrick grunted. "You sure? Kale will have our heads if we miss it." "I'm sure," Lyra said, turning away from Mark's corner. "Let's check the forest edge. If the thief ran, that's where they'd go." She led the way out, and the others followed. The doors closed again, leaving Mark in dim silence. But this time, as Lyra had turned, her eyes had met his for a split second. Not a glance past him, a direct look. And in that moment, Mark saw something, a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then she was gone. She knew. She knew he was here. And she hadn't given him away. Mark exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He wasn't alone. There was someone out there who saw him, who might be an ally. But why? What did she want? For now, it didn't matter. He was still cornered in the barn, holding the orb. The search would continue. He needed to move, to find a way out. But with Lyra's tacit help, maybe he had a chance. He stood up, peering through a crack in the wall. Outside, the village was still swarming with Chosen, but their focus seemed to be shifting toward the forest. The distraction about tracks had worked. For how long, he didn't know. He tucked the orb securely into his tunic, the cold a familiar discomfort now. He had to get to the forest, disappear into the trees. From there, he could figure out what to do with the orb, how to help the village, how to deal with Lyra. He crept to the doors, listening. Distant shouts, but nothing immediate. He pushed one door open a crack, ready to slip out into the chaos. But as he did, he heard boots approaching again, fast. Multiple sets. And Kale's voice, cold and clear, "Secure the barn. No one goes in or out. I want it searched inch by inch." Mark froze, the door still ajar. Outside, he saw Chosen guards taking positions around the barn, forming a perimeter. They weren't looking inside yet, but they were blocking all exits. He was cornered. Again. But this time, with guards stationed outside, escape seemed impossible. He backed away from the door, into the shadows of the barn. The orb's glow seemed brighter now, a beacon in the dim light. He held it tight, his mind racing for a way out, as the footsteps of the approaching search party grew louder at the entrance. The barn smelled of hay and desperation. Mark crouched behind a stack of moldering crates, the orb of subjugation cradled in his green-skinned goblin hands like a stolen heartbeat. Its surface pulsed with a sickly violet light that seemed to throb in time with his own racing pulse. Outside, he could hear the heavy tread of armored boots, the sharp commands of Kale's lieutenants, and the occasional frustrated curse as another search party came up empty. "He's got to be here somewhere," a voice barked, too close for comfort. "The orb's energy signature is strongest in this area. Check every shadow." Mark's breath hitched. They couldn't see him, his absolute neutrality ensured that, but they could track the orb. He'd been a fool to think stealing it would be enough, he hadn't considered it might be magically traceable. The crates around him offered scant cover, and the barn's single door was blocked by two hulking Chosen warriors, their polished plate armor gleaming in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the cracked roof. His mind raced, a frantic tumble of half-formed plans. He could try to slip past them, but the orb's glow would give him away. He could hide it and come back later, but that risked Kale finding it first. Or... He looked down at the orb. Its description in his mental status screen was brief but ominous: Orb of Subjugation, quest item. Channels energy to dominate wills. Warning, unstable when separated from ritual focus. An idea, dangerous and desperate, sparked. If it was unstable, maybe he could use that. Mark closed his eyes, focusing on the orb's energy. It felt like holding a live wire, buzzing with malevolent intent. He remembered snippets of overheard conversations from Kale's camp, something about energy feedback and arcane resonance. Taking a deep breath, he pressed his thumbs against the orb's cool surface and willed it to react. Not to dominate, but to disrupt. At first, nothing happened. Then, a low hum began to emanate from the orb, vibrating up his arms. The violet light intensified, casting jagged shadows across the barn walls. Outside, the voices grew more urgent. Energy spike. It's coming from inside. Move in. Carefully, don't damage the orb. Mark gritted his teeth and pushed harder, imagining the energy expanding outward in a wave. The orb grew hot in his hands, the hum rising to a piercing whine. Just as the barn door burst open, he hurled the orb toward the far wall, not with force, but with a gentle underhand toss that belied the chaos he hoped to unleash. The orb struck the wooden planks and didn't bounce. Instead, it stuck there, pulsing like a malignant star. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, it erupted. A shockwave of violet energy blasted outward, not destructive in a physical sense, but disorienting. The chosen in the doorway staggered, clutching their heads as if struck by a sudden migraine. The air filled with a cacophony of discordant chimes and whispers, the subjugation magic gone haywire, attacking the senses rather than the will. Mark didn't wait. As the guards stumbled, blinded by the psychic noise, he darted forward, a small, green blur in the chaos. He slipped between their legs, his heart hammering against his ribs, and burst out into the cool night air of Sunhaven. The village was in an uproar. Kale's forces were everywhere, but their coordination had fractured. Some were milling about in confusion, others shouting contradictory orders. The orb's explosion had created a perfect smokescreen of arcane interference. Mark didn't look back. He ran, his goblin legs pumping, weaving through alleys and ducking behind cottages, the orb's residual energy tingling on his skin like static. He made for the tree lean at the village's edge, where the dark embrace of the Whisperwood promised cover. He didn't get far. As he reached the last row of houses, a shimmering, transparent screen materialized in the air before him, blocking his path. It was unlike any status screen he'd seen, cold, blue, and devoid of the usual game-like icons. Words scrolled across it in a sterile, mechanical font, anomaly detected. Entity number 447, Goblin Scout, Level 1. Trait, Absolute Neutrality. Aggro value, 0, permanent. Scan initiated. Mark skidded to a halt, cold dread washing over him. This wasn't a chosen skill. This was the system itself, the underlying AI that governed this world. He'd drawn its attention. The screen flickered, and more text appeared, anomaly confirmed. Trait behavior defies standard parameters. Origin analysis, potential divine interference. Reference, rogue deity, entity, null, suspected. Logging incident for Purge Protocol. Purge Protocol. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Mark's mind reeled. A rogue deity? Was that why he was like this? Not a random glitch, but something intentional? The screen dissolved into motes of light, but the feeling of being watched, of being catalogued, remained. He was no longer just a ghost in the machine, he was a bug in the code, and the system had just taken notice. Shaken, he plunged into the woods. The familiar shadows of the trees offered little comfort now. Every rustle of leaves felt like a system enforcer closing in. He ran until his lungs burned, then collapsed against a mossy log, trying to calm his breathing. The orb's distraction had saved him from Kale, but at what cost? "You're harder to track than I expected," a voice said, soft but clear, from the darkness to his left. Mark jerked upright, scrambling back. A figure stepped into a patch of moonlight filtering through the canopy. It was Lyra, the chosen from Kale's camp who had locked eyes with him earlier. She was tall and lean, clad in dark leather armor that seemed to drink the light. Her hair was a practical braid of chestnut brown, and her eyes, a sharp gray, were fixed directly on him. Not near him. On him. "Don't bother hiding," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I can see you. Quite clearly, in fact." Mark's blood ran cold. No one could see him.
Not monsters, not bosses, not chosen. His absolute neutrality made him beneath notice, a non-entity. Yet Lyra's gaze was unwavering, tracking his every twitch.
He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry croak came out. He tried to back away, but his legs felt like lead.
Relax, Lyra said, holding up a hand. I'm not here to turn you in.
If I were, I'd have done it back at the barn. That little light show with the orb was inventive.
Messy, but inventive.
She took a step closer, and Mark flinched.
My name's Lyra.
And you're the ghost they're all whispering about.
The goblin that doesn't exist. How?
Mark managed to whisper, his voice rough with disuse and fear.
Lyra tapped the side of her head.
Unique skill, true sight.
It bypasses perception filters and stealth mechanics. Lets me see things as they really are. Including mobs with zero aggro. When I first sensed you in the camp, I thought I was hallucinating.
But then I saw you again at the village, moving through Kale's men like they were statues.
I've been tracking you since you bolted from the barn. Mark's mind raced.
A skill that could see through his trait. It was his worst nightmare realized. All his safety, all his carefully maintained invisibility, shattered by one person. What do you want? He asked, his voice gaining a sliver of strength.
Information, Lyra said simply. And maybe a partnership. I know what that system alert was about. I felt it, a ripple in the local mana field. You triggered an anomaly scan. That means the system thinks you're a glitch.
And glitches get deleted.
Mark swallowed hard. You know about that?
I've been studying the system's irregularities for months, Lyra said, her expression turning serious.
Kale isn't just a tyrant, he's part of something bigger. He's in league with a rogue deity, a fragment of divine will that's hacking the system. Your trait, this absolute neutrality, it's not natural. It's a flaw introduced by that deity. A backdoor. You're not the only one, either.
There are others like you, entities with zero aggro. The system hunts them down in periodic purges to maintain balance.
The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Mark's rebirth, his cursed gift, it wasn't an accident.
He was a pawn in a divine game.
The thought was both horrifying and strangely liberating.
He had a reason, even if it was a manipulative one.
Why are you telling me this?
Mark asked, suspicion coloring his tone. Because I want to stop Kale, Lyra said, her eyes hardening.
And because you're in a unique position to help. You can go where no one else can.
You can steal information, sabotage plans, all without being seen. I have resources, knowledge of the system's workings, and a network of contacts who distrust Kale.
But I can't do it alone.
I need someone who can operate in the shadows. She took another step forward, now only a few feet away.
So here's my offer, an alliance.
We work together to expose Kale's conspiracy and disrupt the rogue deity's plans. In return, I'll help you understand your trait, warn you of system purges, and protect you as best I can. Mark stared at her, weighing his options. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every instinct screamed to run, to vanish back into the anonymity of the wilds.
But Lyra had seen him. She knew what he was.
And if she could see him, others with similar skills might exist. His safety was an illusion now. Worse, the system itself was after him.
He needed allies, even risky ones. And if I refuse, he asked quietly. Lyra's smile didn't reach her eyes. Then I walk away.
But the system won't.
That anomaly log is in its memory now. It will hunt you, and without someone to guide you, you'll be caught in the next purge.
Plus. She let the word hang, Kale knows the orb was stolen by an unseen force. He's already suspicious. If I were to, say, leave a few hints about a certain zero aggro goblin in the right ears, well, let's just say his methods of interrogation are not gentle. Even if he can't see you, he can flood areas with detection spells. You'd be running forever. It was a threat, thinly veiled but effective. Mark felt a surge of anger, but it was drowned by cold pragmatism. She had him cornered, not with swords, but with information and consequences.
He looked at her, really looked. Her posture was relaxed but ready, her gaze steady.
She wasn't lying, he realized.
Or if she was terrifyingly good at it.
What's the first move, he said finally, the words tasting of resignation and a faint, reluctant hope.
Lyra's smile turned genuine, a quick flash of white in the gloom. Good. We start by getting you out of here. The system scan will have drawn attention.
There's a safe house, a few hours from here. We'll lay low, and I'll fill you in on what I know about the rogue deity and the other zero aggro entities. She extended a hand, not to shake, but to gesture toward a narrow game trail leading deeper into the woods.
Come on, partner. Time to disappear properly.
Mark hesitated for a heartbeat longer, then nodded.
He had no choice, not really.
But as he fell into step beside Lyra, the weight of the orb's aftermath and the system's cold gaze still clinging to him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped from one trap into another. The shadows had been his sanctuary, now, they felt like they were closing in, and the only light came from a chosen who could see right through him. The safe house was a cramped, moss-covered hut nestled deep within the whisperwood, where the trees grew so thick they choked out the moonlight. Mark crouched by a cracked stone hearth, watching Lyra tend to a small fire with practiced hands. The flames cast flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the determined set of her jaw. She was a human player in this brutal game world, yet she moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of survival, not conquest.
Mark's goblin form felt even more alien in her presence.
His green skin, pointed ears, and hunched posture were constant reminders of his mob status. But Lyra's eyes, when they met his, held no contempt. Only a piercing curiosity that made his skin prickle. She had seen him. Truly seen him, despite the absolute neutrality that rendered him invisible to all aggression. Her skill, true sight, was a rare anomaly in a world built on rigid rules. You're still tense, Lyra said without looking up, her voice low and steady. She tossed a handful of dried herbs into a small pot hanging over the fire.
The scent of wild thyme and something earthy filled the hut. I don't blame you. Trusting a chosen after what you've witnessed, it goes against every instinct.
Mark shifted, his claws scraping against the dirt floor.
You threatened to expose me. That doesn't inspire confidence. It was a necessary push, Lyra replied, finally meeting his gaze.
Her eyes were a startling shade of violet, glowing faintly in the dim light.
The system is hunting entities like you, Mark. Zero aggro beings.
Your trait isn't a blessing, it's a flaw exploited by a rogue deity. And Kale is just the tip of the spear. She leaned forward, the firelight dancing in her irises.
Let me explain.
The system that governs this world is glitching. It's supposed to maintain balance between chosen and mobs, but something or someone is tampering with its core code.
The rogue deity, whoever they are, has been inserting these zero aggro traits into random mobs.
You're not the first. I've tracked 3 others in the past year.
Mark's breath hitched. What happened to them? Lyra's expression darkened.
The system detected them as anomalies and purged them.
Erased from existence.
No respawns, no traces.
Just gone.
She stirred the pot absently.
But you're different. Your glitch is more stable. And you've been active, stealing, sabotaging.
The Orb of Subjugation incident triggered a high-level anomaly scan.
That's how I found you.
The system flagged your location, and my true sight let me pinpoint you.
Mark's mind raced.
All this time, he'd thought his invisibility was a unique quirk, a secret advantage. Now it felt like a target painted on his back.
Why are you helping me? You're a chosen. You benefit from the system.
A bitter smile touched Lyra's lips. Not all chosen are like Kale. Some of us remember that this world was once real, before it became a game. The villagers, the mobs, they're not just NPCs. They're people.
And Kale's tyranny is poisoning everything.
She pulled a rolled parchment from her belt and spread it on the floor between them. It was a map of the region, marked with red circles and cryptic notes.
Kale is planning a system-wide takeover. He's in league with the rogue deity.
Together, they want to destabilize the system and seize control.
Mark studied the map.
One circle was labeled Shadowfen Keep, Kale's stronghold. Another marked a village recently enslaved. His gut twisted.
What's the plan? We gather evidence, Lyra said, her voice hardening. Proof of Kale's conspiracy with the deity.
Then we expose him to the broader chosen community.
If enough players turn against him, the system might intervene. But we need concrete proof. And that's where you come in. She tapped the map at Shadowfen Keep. Kale's inner circle meets there every night. Guards, wards, traps, it's impregnable to most. But not to you. With your 0 aggro, you can walk right in. Spy on them. Listen. Find anything that links Kale to the deity.
Mark's claws dug into his palms.
The thought of infiltrating Kale's stronghold sent a chill down his spine.
He'd seen what Kale was capable of, the brutality, the cold efficiency. But Lyra's words echoed in his mind, you're not the first. If he did nothing, he'd end up purged like the others. And Kale would continue his reign unchecked.
I'll do it, Mark said, the words tasting like ash. But not because you threatened me. Because it's right.
Lyra nodded, a flicker of respect in her eyes.
We leave at dusk.
The keep is a half-day's journey from here. I'll get you as close as I can, but you'll have to go the rest of the way alone.
My presence would draw too much attention.
The journey to Shadowfen Keep was a silent, tense affair. Lyra moved through the forest like a ghost, her steps light and sure.
Mark followed, his goblin body surprisingly agile in the undergrowth.
The Whisperwood gave way to rocky foothills, and soon the keep loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the twilight sky. It was built into the side of a mountain, its walls blackened by age and magic. Torches flickered along its battlements, and the air hummed with latent energy.
Lyra halted at the edge of a tree-line, pointing to a narrow crevice in the mountain face.
There's a hidden passage there.
Used by servants. It'll get you inside without crossing the main gates.
Remember, your aggro is 0, but physical contact can still give you away.
Avoid touching anyone.
And don't linger in one place too long, some wards detect prolonged presence.
Mark nodded, his heart pounding. What am I looking for? Anything that mentions the rogue deity.
Scrolls, artifacts, conversations.
Kale's inner circle includes his lieutenants and a few mysterious advisors. Listen to them. Lyra handed him a small, smooth stone. This is a memory crystal. Hold it when you hear something important, and it'll record the audio. I'll extract it later. Mark pocketed the crystal, its surface cool against his skin. And if I get caught?
You won't, Lyra said, but her eyes betrayed a hint of doubt.
Just be careful.
With that, she melted back into the shadows, leaving Mark alone at the foot of the mountain. He took a deep breath, focusing on the absolute neutrality that wrapped around him like a cloak. Then he started toward the crevice. The passage was dark and narrow, smelling of damp stone and mildew. Mark crept forward, his claws scraping softly against the rock. After what felt like an eternity, he emerged into a dimly lit storeroom stacked with crates and barrels. Muffled voices echoed from somewhere beyond the door.
Mark slipped out, keeping to the shadows. The keep's interior was a labyrinth of stone corridors and arched doorways.
Tapestries depicting battles and conquests lined the walls, and the floor was cold underfoot. Mark moved like a phantom, passing guards who stood at attention, their eyes scanning for threats that didn't include him. He felt a surreal disconnect. Here he was, a level 1 Goblin Scout, walking through the heart of his enemy's domain, utterly unseen. He followed the sound of voices to a large chamber with heavy oak doors slightly ajar. Peering through the crack, he saw Kale seated at a long table, flanked by his lieutenants. The room was lit by enchanted crystals that cast a pale, eerie glow. Kale himself was an imposing figure, tall, with armor that seemed to drink the light, and a face carved from granite. His eyes were cold, calculating. The ritual at the village failed because of interference, Kale was saying, his voice a low rumble. The orb of subjugation was compromised.
Our source indicates it was a zero aggro entity.
One of the lieutenants, a woman with scarred cheeks, frowned.
How is that possible?
The system purges them on detection.
This one is different, Kale replied, steepling his fingers. Our patron believes it's a key piece in the grand design.
The deity has assured me that this entity, this mark, is instrumental to our plans.
Mark's blood ran cold. They know my name.
Another lieutenant, a burly man with a beard, leaned forward.
And the system?
The anomaly scans are increasing. If we push too hard, it might trigger a full purge event. Kale smiled, a thin, cruel curve of his lips.
Let it. The more chaos, the better.
Our patron is weaving the glitches into the system's code as we speak.
Soon, we'll have an army of zero aggro beings under our control. Unseen, unstoppable.
And with them, we'll overthrow the system's governance and claim this world for ourselves.
He stood, pacing slowly.
The next phase begins at the Blood Moon Convergence.
The deity will channel enough power to corrupt the core dungeon bosses, turning them into loyalists.
We'll have our foot soldiers, and the zero aggro agents will be our scouts and saboteurs. Mark's hand tightened around the memory crystal in his pocket.
He activated it, feeling a faint warmth as it began recording.
This was it, the evidence Lyra needed. But his mind reeled.
Asterisk, an army of beings like me.
Pawns in a deity's game, asterisk.
What about the current zero aggro entities? The scarred woman asked. The ones still free?
They'll be recruited or eliminated, Kale said dismissively.
Our patron has eyes everywhere.
Speaking of which, he turned toward a shadowed corner of the room.
You've been listening long enough, haven't you?
For a heart-stopping moment, Mark thought he'd been discovered. But then a figure detached itself from the shadows, a tall, slender being clad in robes that seemed to shift and shimmer. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but an aura of palpable power radiated from it.
The rogue deity.
Indeed, the deity said, its voice a melodic whisper that grated on the ears.
The entity known as Mark is closer than you think. He is here, in this keep. His presence is a gift, a testament to my designs.
The deity glided toward the table, placing a hand on Kale's shoulder. Do not fear the system's purges. They are but ripples in a pond. Soon, we will drain the pond entirely. Prepare your forces, Kale.
The Blood Moon Convergence is in 3 days. And Mark, he will play his part, willingly or not. Mark's breath caught in his throat.
He backed away slowly, his mind screaming at him to flee. But as he turned, his foot brushed against a loose stone. It clattered softly, rolling a few inches. Kale's head snapped toward the door.
What was that?
Mark froze, pressing himself against the wall.
The deity chuckled. A little mouse in the walls. Pay it no mind. It cannot harm us.
But Kale's eyes narrowed.
Search the corridor. Now. Mark didn't wait.
He bolted, his goblin legs pumping as he raced back through the labyrinth. Behind him, he heard the shouts of guards, the clatter of armor. He ducked into the storeroom, heart hammering against his ribs, and squeezed back into the crevice passage. Darkness swallowed him, but he didn't slow down until he burst out into the cool night air. He ran until the keep was a distant speck against the mountain, then collapsed against a tree, gasping. The memory crystal felt heavy in his pocket. He had the evidence, Kale's conspiracy, the deity's plans, the Blood Moon Convergence. But he also had a terrifying new truth: he was a pawn in a game far larger than he'd imagined. And the players knew his name. As he caught his breath, he looked back toward Shadowfen Keep. The torches still burned, but now they seemed like watchful eyes. Kale and the rogue deity were planning a system-wide takeover, and they saw Mark not as a threat, but as a tool. The chapter of mere survival was over. Now, he had to decide, would he be a weapon for their conquest, or the flaw that broke their design? The night wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of impending storm. Mark clutched the crystal tighter, knowing that his next move would change everything. The safe house smelled of damp earth and old parchment. Mark crouched by a makeshift table, his goblin fingers tracing the rough lines of a map Lyra had spread before them. The flickering light of a single glowstone cast long shadows across her determined face. Shadowfen Keep's vault is here, Lyra whispered, tapping a point deep within the fortress's central tower. 3 floors underground, behind 3 layers of security, physical guards, mechanical traps, and magical wards.
Kale isn't taking any chances with these documents.
Mark studied the map, his mind racing. The previous night's infiltration had left him jittery, the rogue deity's voice still echoed in his ears, that chilling acknowledgement that he was being watched, manipulated. He glanced at the memory crystal resting beside the map, its surface shimmering with the recorded conversation.
Proof of conspiracy, but not enough.
They needed the physical evidence, the signed treaties, the resource ledgers, the deity's manifests. Without them, it was just his word against a powerful chosen's.
The guards won't see me, Mark said, his voice low. But the traps and wards, my trait doesn't make me incorporeal.
If I trigger a pressure plate or cross a magical barrier, it'll still go off.
Lyra nodded, pulling out a second parchment, a crude diagram of the vault's interior, sketched from rumors and old blueprints. I've studied what I could.
The mechanical traps are mostly dart launchers and pitfalls, triggered by weight. You're light, but not weightless. You'll need to move carefully, test each step.
The magical wards are trickier.
They're designed to detect hostile intent or unauthorized presence. Your zero aggro might confuse them, but there's a central ward at the vault door, a sentinel eye. It's supposed to see through all illusions and stealth.
If it detects you. She didn't finish the sentence.
Mark knew what it meant: alarm, lockdown, capture. He felt a cold knot in his stomach. For months, he'd relied on his invisibility to enemies, moving through dungeons and battlefields like a ghost. But this was different, systematic, deliberate security designed by someone who might suspect his existence. The rogue deity's words haunted him: he is here.
Let him listen. He will be useful. Was this a setup? A trap within a trap? Why are you doing this? Mark asked suddenly, looking up at Lyra.
Her chosen status marked her with an aura of faint light, visible even in the dim room. She could have reported him, turned him in for bounty or favor.
Instead, she was risking everything.
Lyra met his gaze, her eyes serious.
Because Kale's tyranny isn't just about enslaving villages. He's corrupting the system itself, and if that deity succeeds, everything collapses: chosen, mobs, the whole world. I've seen what happens when power goes unchecked.
And you're an anomaly, but you're trying to do something right.
That's rare.
Mark nodded slowly, a flicker of trust warming his cautious heart.
All right. What's the plan?
2 hours later, they stood in the shadow of Shadowfen Keep's outer wall.
The fortress loomed against a starless sky, its dark stone bristling with torches and patrols.
The Blood Moon convergence was only days away, and activity had intensified. Chosen soldiers marched in squads, war machines were being assembled in the courtyards, and the air thrummed with anticipation. Lyra had used a distraction spell to create a minor commotion near the east gate, drawing away a group of guards. Now, they slipped through a neglected drainage grate, crawling into a narrow tunnel that led to the lower levels. The smell of mildew and stagnant water filled Mark's nostrils as he moved ahead, his goblin form easily navigating the tight space. Lyra followed, her larger frame scraping against the stone, her breath coming in controlled puffs. This tunnel should emerge near the storage cellars, Lyra whispered, her voice echoing softly. From there, we take the servant stairs to the vault level. Remember, once we're inside, I'll handle the guards with illusions, but you need to get past the wards. I can't help you there, my magic might trigger them.
Mark nodded, his senses hyper-alert.
The memory of nearly being caught in Kale's meeting room made every shadow seem threatening. He could hear distant shouts, the clank of armor, the hum of magical energies. This was the heart of enemy territory, and one misstep meant disaster. They reached the tunnel's end, peering through a rusty grate into a dimly lit cellar. Barrels and crates were stacked haphazardly, and 2 guards lounged by a door, playing a dice game.
Mark waited, watching.
His trait meant they wouldn't perceive him as a threat, but if he moved too openly, they might notice motion.
He had to time it perfectly. Lyra raised a hand, murmuring an incantation.
A faint shimmer passed through the air, and one of the guards suddenly stood up, pointing toward a far corner.
"Did you hear that?" he said.
The other guard shrugged, but both turned to investigate, stepping away from the door.
"Now," Lyra hissed.
Mark pushed the grate open slowly, wincing at the faint creak. He slipped out, keeping low behind a barrel. The guards were still distracted, peering into the shadows where Lyra's illusion had created a phantom noise. Mark darted across the cellar, his bare feet silent on the stone floor. He reached the door, easing it open just enough to slide through. Lyra followed moments later, closing it gently behind them. They were in a narrow corridor, lit by flickering sconces. The air grew colder as they descended a spiral staircase, the sound of their footsteps muffled by thick dust.
Mark's heart pounded.
Every sense screamed danger, but his trait held steady. The few patrolling guards they passed glanced right through him, their eyes sliding off as if he were part of the scenery. Lyra moved with practiced stealth, using small glamours to blend into the shadows when needed. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a heavy iron door marked with warning runes. The vault level. Beyond it, the corridor widened into a hall lined with cells and storage rooms, but at the far end stood the vault itself, a massive construct of enchanted steel and glowing crystals. 2 elite guards in full plate armor flanked the entrance, their eyes scanning constantly. Between them, set into the floor, was a complex magical circle, pulsing with a soft blue light.
The Sentinel Eye.
"That's it," Lyra breathed, crouching behind a pillar with Mark. The eye scans for any presence not keyed to Kale or his lieutenants. If it detects you, it'll unleash a binding spell and alert every guard in the keep. I'll create a diversion to draw the guards away, but you'll have to cross the ward alone. Your zero aggro might make you seem like background noise to it, but there's no guarantee.
Mark swallowed hard, staring at the eye. It looked like a large, unblinking orb of crystal, swirling with inner light.
He could feel its power from here, a cold, analytical presence that seemed to peer into his very soul.
Did it see his trait? Did it register him as nothing, or as an anomaly to be purged?
"What's the diversion?" he asked. Lyra pulled a small pouch from her belt, filled with powdered illusion components.
"A phantom intruder on the upper levels.
It should pull these guards away for a minute or two.
That's all the time you'll have.
Once you're inside, grab everything that looks important: scrolls, ledgers, sealed documents.
I've enchanted this bag to hold more than it should."
She handed him a leather satchel that felt oddly weightless. "I'll wait here.
If anything goes wrong, run. Don't wait for me."
Mark took the bag, his fingers trembling slightly.
He met her eyes, seeing the grim determination there.
"Be careful," he said.
Lyra gave a tight smile.
"You too, Ghost." She began her incantation, her hands weaving intricate patterns in the air.
Mark focused on the vault door, mapping his path.
He'd need to move fast but smoothly, avoiding the magical circle's outer edges.
His mind replayed the deity's words, "He will be useful." Was this the moment? Would the ward ignore him because the deity willed it? Or was that just paranoia?
A sudden alarm clanged from upstairs, shouts echoed, and the 2 elite guards snapped to attention.
"Intruder on level 2, one barked."
They exchanged glances, then one ran toward the staircase, while the other remained, his hand on his sword hilt.
"Damn," Lyra muttered. "Only one left. You'll have to time it perfectly." Mark waited, watching the remaining guard.
The man paced nervously, his eyes darting between the vault and the corridor.
The Sentinel Eye continued its slow pulse, undisturbed. Mark took a deep breath, centering himself.
He thought of the village, of the people he'd tried to help, of the larger game he was now part of.
He couldn't back down.
As the guard turned to look up the staircase, Mark moved. He slipped from behind the pillar, moving in a low crouch across the hall.
His goblin form was small and quick, a blur in the dim light.
He reached the edge of the magical circle, pausing. The eye's light washed over him, and for a heart-stopping second, he felt a probing sensation, a cold touch on his mind, searching for hostility, for threat. His Aggro Stat, locked at 0, seemed to confuse it, the sensation wavered, then faded, as if dismissing him as insignificant background static. But it wasn't gone entirely, he could feel it lingering, attentive. He stepped into the circle, moving toward the vault door. The guard was still distracted, listening to the commotion above. Mark reached the door, finding it sealed with a complex lock. Lyra had given him a bypass charm, a small, glowing token. He pressed it against the lock, and with a soft click, the mechanisms disengaged. He pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. The vault was a small, circular room, lined with shelves and secure chests. Glowing crystals provided cold, steady light, illuminating stacks of parchment, sealed scroll cases, and ornate boxes. Mark didn't hesitate. He began grabbing everything that looked official: thick ledgers with Kale's seal, treaties signed in strange inks, manifests listing resources and zero aggro entities, even a few personal journals. He stuffed them into the enchanted bag, which swallowed them without bulging. His hands worked quickly, but his mind was racing. Each document felt heavy with consequence, with secrets that could topple empires. He was reaching for a particularly large scroll case when he heard a faint hum from the doorway. The Sentinel Eye's light had intensified, its beam focusing on the vault entrance. The probing sensation returned, stronger now, more insistent. It wasn't just scanning for threats, it was analyzing anomalies. Mark froze, his blood running cold. The deity's influence? Or had he triggered something by taking the documents? Outside, the remaining guard stirred, turning back toward the vault. "What's that?" he muttered, stepping closer to the eye. Mark shoved the last few items into the bag and slung it over his shoulder. He had to get out, now. He crept to the door, peering through the crack. The guard was standing right outside, peering at the eye, which was now glowing a faint red. An alarm was moments away. Thinking fast, Mark pulled a small, worthless trinket from a shelf, a decorative paperweight. He tossed it gently across the vault, letting it clatter against the far wall. The guard's head snapped toward the sound, and he stepped inside, drawing his sword. "Who's there?" he demanded. Mark slipped past him, out the door, and back into the hall. But as he crossed the magical circle again, the eye flared bright red. A piercing shriek filled the air, the alarm. The guard whirled, but Mark was already moving, sprinting toward Lyra's hiding place. "Go!" Lyra shouted, emerging from behind the pillar. She cast a blinding flash of light toward the guard, then grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the staircase. "The whole keep will be on us." They raced up the stairs, footsteps echoing behind them. Shouts and the clatter of armor reverberated through the stone corridors. Mark's trait kept the pursuing guards from directly targeting him, but they could see Lyra, and their spells and arrows flew toward her. She deflected a crossbow bolt with a shimmering barrier, but another grazed her shoulder, drawing blood. "Keep moving," she gritted out, her face pale with pain. They burst into the cellar, where the earlier guards were now alert and joining the chase. Lyra unleashed a wave of force, knocking barrels into their path, creating a temporary blockade. They scrambled through the drainage tunnel, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter but not gone. When they emerged outside the walls, into the relative safety of a dense forest, Lyra collapsed against a tree, clutching her wounded shoulder. Blood seeped through her fingers, dark and ominous. "We made it," Mark panted, looking back at the keep. Lights were swarming like angry bees, search parties forming. "But they'll be after us." Lyra nodded weakly, her breath ragged. "We have the evidence. That's what matters. But Kale won't let this go. He'll launch a full-scale hunt, for me, for you, for anyone connected." Mark helped her to her feet, supporting her as they stumbled deeper into the woods. The enchanted bag felt heavy with secrets, with power. They had what they needed to expose Kale, but the cost was high. As they disappeared into the shadows, Mark knew the game had escalated. He was no longer just a ghost in the machine, he was a thief who had stolen from a king, and the king would stop at nothing to get his treasure back. The safe house was little more than a hollowed-out tree stump, hidden deep within the whispering woods where the canopy grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated. Mark dragged Lyra through the final curtain of hanging moss, his small goblin frame straining under her weight. She was pale, her breathing shallow, the crossbow bolt still protruding from her shoulder. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage he'd applied during their frantic escape from Shadowfen Keep. "Just a bit further," Mark whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. His voice was the raspy croak of a goblin, a sound that still felt foreign in his throat. He guided her to a bed of dried moss in the center of the stump, the space barely large enough for the two of them. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying wood, a scent that had become familiar in his months of hiding. Lyra groaned as he lowered her. "The bolt needs to come out." "I know," Mark said, rummaging through the stolen documents they'd stuffed into a leather satchel. Among the scrolls and parchments, he found the rare healing potion he'd pocketed back in Chapter 2, a small vial of shimmering blue liquid. "Drink this first. It should help with the pain." He uncorked the vial and held it to her lips. Lyra's eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were clouded with pain. She drank greedily, the potion's magic immediately bringing color back to her cheeks. Mark watched, his mind racing. This was the first time he'd used one of his stolen treasures for someone else. The realization struck him with unexpected force: he was no longer just surviving. He was investing in an ally. "Now," Lyra said through gritted teeth. "Pull it out." Mark hesitated. His goblin hands were small and clumsy, better suited for picking locks than field surgery. But there was no one else. He gripped the bolt's shaft, feeling the rough wood against his green skin. "On 3. 1, 2. He yanked it out on 2, the sudden motion making Lyra cry out. Blood flowed fresh, but the healing potion's magic already knitted the wound shut, leaving only a puckered scar. Lyra collapsed back onto the moss, breathing heavily. "You're full of surprises, Goblin." "My name is Mark," he said, more sharply than he intended. He was tired of being defined by his form. "Mark," she repeated, testing the name. "Fine. Mark. The documents. We need to see what Kale was hiding." Mark nodded, spreading the parchments across the moss floor. The safe house was dim, lit only by a few bioluminescent fungi growing on the stump's walls. He squinted at the elegant script, chosen script, not the crude glyphs of goblin kind. Lyra propped herself up, her unique skill, eyes of true sight, allowing her to read even in the low light. It was that same skill that let her perceive Mark despite his absolute neutrality, a fact that still unnerved him. "This isn't just about enslaving villages," Lyra murmured, her fingers tracing a diagram of the system's architecture. "Look here." Kale's notes referenced something called the Zero Protocol. Mark leaned closer. The diagram showed the system AI a vast, glowing network of energy with several nodes highlighted in red. Next to each node was a label, Aggro Anomaly. One of them had a footnote, subject, Goblin Scout, Mark. Status, active. Origin, divine glitch, absolute neutrality, ... A cold dread settled in Mark's stomach. He'd known he was an anomaly, but seeing it documented so clinically made him feel like a specimen. "What's the Zero Protocol?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra scanned further. "It's a subroutine of the system, designed to identify and eliminate entities with permanently zero aggro. But according to this, it's been corrupted." She pointed to a section where Kale's handwriting grew frantic. "He writes about a rogue deity, a being outside the system who's hijacking the protocol. Instead of eliminating zero aggro entities, it's creating more of them." Creating them? Mark's mind flashed to the battlefield in Chapter 4, where he'd seen Chosen slaughtering mobs without thought. "Why would anyone want more creatures like me?" "Pawns," Lyra said, her tone grim. She shuffled through more documents, finding a list of names and locations. "Look. These are all reported zero aggro mobs across the region. A slime in the Crystal Caves, a wolf in the Frostfang Mountains, even a dragon wormling in the Ember Peaks. All with the same trait as you. And here." She tapped a heavily encrypted page. "Kale's correspondence with the rogue deity. They're calling it Project Shadowfall." Mark's hands trembled as he picked up the page. The encryption was complex, but Lyra's eyes of true sight seemed to decipher it instinctively. She read aloud, her voice hollow. The Zero Protocol will be repurposed to generate an army of unseen agents. These entities will operate beneath the system's notice, gathering intelligence, sabotaging chosen operations, and ultimately destabilizing the balance of power. The Goblin Scout is proof of concept, a successful instance of absolute neutrality, induced by divine interference. Our goal, mass production. Silence hung in the safe house, broken only by the distant drip of water from the moss. Mark stared at his hands, small, green, utterly ordinary except for the trait that made him invisible to aggression. All this time, he thought his zero aggro was a curse, then a tool for survival. Now he realized it might be a design. A flaw exploited not just by chance, but by intention. I'm a pawn, he said, the words tasting bitter. All those heists, all that sneaking around, was I even making my own choices? Or was I playing into someone else's game? Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt strangely human coming from a chosen to a goblin. You saved that village. You stole these documents. Those were your choices, Mark. Don't let this make you doubt yourself. But doubt was already coiling in his chest. He thought back to Chapter 1, waking in that dark cave. Had the rogue deity placed him there? Was his entire existence in this world just an experiment? He stood up, pacing the small space. We need to know more. What does the rogue deity want? And why is Kale helping it? Lyra returned to the documents. Kale's motives are clear. Power. He believes that by allying with the rogue deity, he can become more than just a chosen, he can become a god within the system. But the deity. She frowned. There's a fragment here. It mentions correcting a flaw in the divine design. The system was created by gods, but this rogue one thinks it's imperfect. It wants to use zero aggro entities to rewrite the rules. Mark stopped pacing. Rewrite the rules? You mean like changing how aggro works for everyone? Possibly. Or something bigger. The documents are incomplete. But one thing's clear, the system AI knows about the corruption. It's been trying to purge the anomalies, but the rogue deity keeps interfering. Lyra pointed to a recent entry. Kale notes that the AI is preparing a purge event, a full-scale sweep to eliminate all zero aggro entities before Project Shadowfall can advance. As if on cue, a low hum filled the air. It started as a vibration in the ground, then grew into a resonant frequency that made the fungi lights flicker. Mark and Lyra exchanged alarmed looks. Through a crack in the stump, Mark saw the forest outside glowing with an unnatural blue light. What is that? Lyra whispered. Mark crept to the crack, peering out. Above the canopy, streaks of blue energy arced across the sky, converging on specific points in the distance. Where they touched down, the very air seemed to warp, and he could hear distant screams, not of pain, but of digital deletion. The system AI was making its move. It's the purge event, Mark said, his heart pounding. It's starting now. Lyra struggled to her feet, clutching her shoulder. We need to move. If the AI is targeting zero aggro entities, it'll have a trace on you. This safe house won't stay safe for long. But Mark was frozen, watching the blue streaks. Each one represented another creature like him, a slime, a wolf, a dragon wormling, being hunted for simply existing. He thought of the wounded animal he'd helped in Chapter 3, the first time he'd chosen to act beyond survival. Was that his own morality, or part of the rogue deity's design? The question gnawed at him. Mark! Lyra's voice broke through his reverie. We have to go. She grabbed the documents, stuffing them back into the satchel. He turned to her, his goblin face set in a determined grimace. Where? If the system is purging anomalies, there's nowhere to hide. There might be, Lyra said, her eyes scanning the documents one last time. Kale mentioned a sanctuary, a place where zero aggro entities have gathered. He was planning to raid it. If we can get there first. She trailed off as a blue streak shot through the woods nearby, vaporizing a tree trunk with a sound like shattering glass. The purge was getting closer. Mark made a decision. Pawn or not,
he couldn't stand by while others were erased. Do you know where this sanctuary is? Lyra nodded, pulling out a map from the satchel. Roughly. It's in the sunken caverns, to the east.
But it's a day's journey, and with the purge active.
She didn't need to finish. The risk was immense.
Then we go, Mark said. He slung the satchel over his shoulder, the weight of the documents feeling heavier than ever. They weren't just evidence now, they were a guide to his own nature. As they slipped out of the safe house, the blue light intensifying around them, Mark glanced back at the hollowed stump. It had been a refuge, however temporary. Now, the world itself was becoming hostile in a new way. The system AI, once a distant overseer, was now an active hunter. And the rogue deity, whoever or whatever it was, had made him a piece in a cosmic game. Stay close, Lyra said, her eyes of true sight scanning for threats. The AI's enforcers will be visible, but they might not perceive you. Use your trait. Mark nodded, his absolute neutrality wrapping around him like a cloak. As they moved through the glowing forest, he couldn't shake the revelation. He was a tool, a glitch given purpose. But as he watched Lyra limp ahead, trusting him to watch her back, he realized something else: tools could choose their wielders. And he was done being a pawn. The chapter ends with Mark and Lyra vanishing into the woods, the sky above alive with the system's purge, and the knowledge that his zero aggro might be the key to stopping a war he never asked for. The Whispering Woods, once a place of gentle rustles and dappled sunlight, had become a hunting ground. Blue energy streaks, thin, crackling lines of light that hummed with a sterile, mechanical fury, cut through the canopy like celestial scalpels. Each streak homed in on the faintest whisper of anomalous existence, seeking the zero aggro signatures the system had marked for deletion. Mark crouched beside Lyra in the hollow of an ancient oak, his goblin heart hammering against his ribs. The safe house, a moss-covered burrow they'd used for less than an hour, was already compromised. Through a gap in the roots, he watched a streak zip past, its light casting stark shadows that made the forest look like a skeletal hand. It paused, hovering near a cluster of ferns where a small, mouse-like creature with shimmering fur, another zero aggro entity, Mark realized with a chill, had hidden. The streak pulsed once, and the creature dissolved into motes of blue data, erased without a sound. They're not just hunting, Lyra whispered, her voice tight with pain. She leaned against the tree trunk, a bandage soaked with healing salve wrapped around her shoulder where a trap in Kale's vault had grazed her. It's a systematic purge. The Zero Protocol, Project Shadowfall, it's activating. Mark's fingers tightened around the decoded documents in his hand, parchment crinkling. The words swam before his eyes: utilize zero aggro anomalies as undetectable agents for destabilization, rogue deity intervention confirmed, sanctuary locations may be compromised. He felt a cold knot in his stomach. All this time, he'd thought his absolute neutrality was a fluke, a glitch that gave him a chance to survive. Now, it seemed he was a pawn in a divine game, and the board was being wiped clean. We need to move, Mark said, his voice low. The sunken caverns, if the sanctuary exists, it's our only shot. Lyra nodded, pushing herself up with a grimace. I can sense others fleeing. Scattered signatures, like embers in the wind. We should try to warn them, guide them if we can. Mark hesitated. Warning others meant exposure, risk. But the memory of that dissolving mouse creature flashed in his mind. He wasn't just a ghost anymore, he had to be more. All right. But stay close. Your skill lets you see me, but to the enforcers, I'm nothing. You're the vulnerable one. They slipped from the oak, moving through the woods with a practiced stealth born of desperation. Mark's trait made him invisible to the streaks, they passed over him like he was part of the scenery, but Lyra's presence was a beacon. Twice, they had to duck behind rocks as enforcers materialized, humanoid figures clad in sleek, silver armor that seemed to absorb light, their faces featureless masks glowing with the same blue energy. They moved with uncanny precision, scanning the area with devices that emitted soft pings. Over there, Lyra hissed, pointing to a clearing where a fox with iridescent eyes, another zero aggro mob, was cowering. A streak descended toward it. Mark acted without thinking. He darted forward, his goblin body small and swift. As the streak closed in, he scooped up a rock and threw it at a distant tree. The thud echoed, and the streak diverted momentarily, confused by the noise without a threat signature.
The fox bolted into the underbrush.
Mark gestured frantically toward the east, where the terrain sloped downward toward rumored caverns. The fox seemed to understand, vanishing with a flick of its tail. "That was reckless," Lyra said when he returned, but there was a hint of admiration in her eyes.
"You're getting better at this."
"Desperation is a good teacher," Mark muttered.
"Come on."
As they descended into a rocky gorge, the air grew damp and cool.
The blue streaks became less frequent, but the enforcers were more concentrated, patrolling in pairs. Mark used his invisibility to scout ahead, slipping past guards who stared right through him.
He'd pause, listen to their mechanical chatter. Anomaly cluster detected in Sector 7.
Proceed with eradication.
Then relay the information to Lyra via hand signals. It was tense, exhausting work, but they managed to guide 2 more zero-aggro entities, a silent, floating jellyfish-like creature that phased through stone, and a timid, moss-covered slime that quivered at every sound. By nightfall, they reached the entrance to the sunken caverns, a jagged fissure in the cliffside, hidden behind a waterfall that roared with icy water. The roar drowned out the hum of the purge, but Mark felt no relief.
Lyra's skill, Eyes of the Unseen, allowed her to detect a faint, collective signature emanating from within. "There are many," she breathed. "Dozens, maybe more. All like you."
They entered cautiously, the path slick with algae. Glowmoss provided a soft, greenish light, illuminating tunnels that twisted deep into the earth. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, a sense of ancient stillness.
After what felt like hours of winding descent, they emerged into a vast cavern.
Mark stopped, his breath catching. The sanctuary was not what he'd expected. It wasn't a fortified hideout, but a living, breathing community. Bioluminescent fungi clung to the walls, casting a gentle blue glow over stalactites that dripped with crystalline water. In the center, a pool reflected the light like a starry sky. And around it, zero-aggro entities moved quietly, creatures of all shapes and sizes, from a towering, silent treant with bark that shimmered like obsidian, to tiny, skittering insects that left no trace. There were no chosen here, only mobs like him, all bearing the same eerie calm of being beneath notice. At the pool's edge sat their leader. An ancient being, it appeared as a wizened, humanoid figure carved from petrified wood, its eyes deep sockets that held a timeless wisdom. It moved slowly, tending to a garden of glowing mushrooms, and as Mark and Lyra approached, it turned its head without surprise. "You have come," it said, its voice a rustle of leaves and stone.
"I am Arcturus.
We have been expecting the purge, but not so soon." The rogue deity grows impatient. Mark stepped forward, Lyra at his side.
"You know about the deity? About Project Shadowfall?" Arcturus nodded, a creaking motion. "We are its creations, its mistakes."
The system's zero protocol was meant to eliminate glitches, but the deity exploited it, weaving absolute neutrality into beings like us to serve as unseen hands. I have existed for centuries, watching, waiting.
Many of us chose this sanctuary to avoid being tools.
Lyra spoke up, her tone urgent.
The enforcers are closing in.
We saw them in the gorge. They'll find this place. They already have, Arcturus said calmly.
The sanctuary's shielding is failing. The deity's interference has drawn too much attention.
But we have prepared.
We will not go quietly. As if on cue, a tremor shook the cavern.
Dust rained from the ceiling, and the pool's surface rippled violently.
From the tunnels they'd entered, shouts echoed, not the mechanical tones of enforcers, but the rough voices of chosen.
Kale's forces. He's here, Mark whispered, a cold dread settling in.
He must have tracked Lyra's signature or intercepted the purge data. Arcturus rose, its form seeming to grow, shadows deepening around it. Go to the rear tunnel.
It leads to an escape route, but it is narrow.
Evacuate the young and the weak. We will hold them off. Mark shook his head. No. I can help. I'm invisible to them. I can sabotage, steal, distract. Lyra gripped his arm. Mark, it's too dangerous. If Kale has any detection artifacts.
I have to try, he insisted. The faces of the zero aggro entities around him, creatures who'd found a fragile peace, filled him with a resolve he hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about protecting something worth saving. He darted toward the entrance tunnel, Lyra cursing but following. The cavern erupted into chaos. Kale's chosen burst in, armored and wielding glowing weapons. Behind them, enforcers materialized, their blue streaks scanning the area. The zero aggro mobs, though non-aggressive, used their traits to evade, phasing through walls, blending into shadows, but they were cornered. Mark moved like a ghost. He slipped past a chosen warrior who was barking orders, and pocketed a grenade-like device from the warrior's belt. He tossed it into a cluster of enforcers. It exploded in a shower of sparks, disrupting their sensors. In the confusion, Arcturus raised its hands, and the cavern's fungi flared bright, blinding several attackers. But Kale himself stood at the tunnel mouth, a towering figure in dark plate armor, his face hidden behind a helmet that glowed with malevolent red runes. He held a staff that crackled with energy, and his eyes, visible through the visor, scanned the room with predatory focus. "Find the anomaly," he roared. "The one who stole my orb. He's here, I can feel it." Mark froze. Kale couldn't see him, but his presence was a palpable threat. Lyra, hiding behind a stalagmite, met Mark's eyes and nodded toward a side passage. "The escape route, we need to go, now," she mouthed. But as Mark turned, he saw a group of smaller zero aggro entities, a family of crystalline lizards, trapped by collapsing rocks. Without hesitation, he ran to them, using his strength to heave a stone aside. The lizards scurried to safety, but the noise drew Kale's attention. "There!" Kale pointed, not at Mark, but at the disturbance. He fired a bolt of energy that shattered the rock where Mark had been standing. Lyra cried out, rushing forward to draw fire, but an enforcer intercepted her, its blade slicing toward her injured shoulder. Mark acted on instinct. He grabbed a loose stalactite and, with all his goblin might, hurled it at the enforcer. It struck true, knocking the creature off balance. Lyra rolled away, but the enforcer's device beeped. It had logged an anomalous impact. The system AI's voice echoed through the cavern, cold and omnipresent, anomaly confirmed. Zero aggro entity engaging in hostile action. Initiating deletion protocol. Blue streaks converged on Mark's location, but Arcturus stepped in front of him, its body absorbing the energy with a shudder. "Go!" Arcturus commanded, its form beginning to crack and glow. "Warn the others. The sanctuary falls, but the fight is not over." Mark hesitated, but Lyra grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the rear tunnel. As they fled, he glanced back. The cavern was a battleground, zero aggro mobs using their traits to delay, enforcers erasing them one by one, Kale's forces looting and destroying. Arcturus stood tall, a final barrier, before dissolving into a burst of light that temporarily blinded the pursuers. They stumbled into the narrow escape tunnel, darkness swallowing them. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the drip of water and their ragged breaths. Lyra leaned against the wall, her face pale. "We lost them," she whispered. "All those beings." Mark slumped to the ground, the weight of failure crushing him. But in his pocket, his fingers brushed against something, a small, glowing shard he'd picked up from the cavern floor, a piece of Arcturus's essence. It pulsed softly, a reminder of sacrifice. "We didn't lose everything," he said, his voice steadying. "We have evidence, and we have each other. And now we know the rogue deity's plan is in motion. We have to stop it, before more sanctuaries fall." As they caught their breath in the dark, the distant rumble of collapsing rock signaled the end of the sanctuary. But ahead, the tunnel promised escape, and a new resolve burned in Mark's heart. The purge had begun, but so had their rebellion. The escape tunnel from the sunken cavern spat Mark and Lyra out into a dense, mist-shrouded forest, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Behind them, the distant echoes of collapsing stone and magical explosions marked the sanctuary's final moments. Mark clutched the shard of Arcturus's essence in his small goblin hand, a faintly glowing crystal that pulsed with a warmth that felt both ancient and sorrowful. Lyra leaned against a moss-covered tree, her breathing ragged, a fresh cut on her arm from their narrow escape. "We can't stop here," Lyra said, her voice strained. "Kale's forces will sweep the perimeter. The system enforcers might already be tracking residual energy from the purge event. Mark nodded, his yellow eyes scanning the mist. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. In his mind, the plan was already forming, a chaotic, desperate gambit born from Arcturus's sacrifice. He remembered the ancient Zero Aggro entity's last words: "Our strength is not in confrontation, but in the cracks they cannot see." "We need to turn their attack against them," Mark said, his voice a low rasp. Kale brought siege engines to breach the sanctuary.
"If we sabotage them, we can cripple his advance and create an opening."
Lyra frowned, wiping blood from her arm with a torn piece of cloth.
"Sabotage?"
"Mark, you're a level 1 Goblin Scout.
Those engines are guarded by elite chosen and enchanted wards.
One touch, and they'll detect you." "But they won't perceive me as a threat," Mark countered, tapping his status screen mentally.
The absolute neutrality trait glowed faintly in his vision. Aggro locked at 0. "I've looted dungeons under bosses' noses.
I stole Kale's orb right from his lieutenant. This is what I do, I move through their world like a ghost." He paused, the weight of Arcturus's shard in his hand.
"And I have this now." Arcturus said its essence could amplify Zero Aggro traits temporarily.
"If I use it, I might be able to bypass even magical detection for a short time." Lyra's eyes narrowed, her unique skill, perception beyond aggro, allowing her to see Mark clearly where others saw nothing. She studied him, the small, green-skinned goblin who had become an unlikely ally in a conspiracy that spanned deities.
"It's risky.
The shard might draw the system's attention directly.
But I don't see another option.
The sanctuary survivors are scattered.
Kale won't stop until every Zero Aggro entity is purged."
"Then let's give him a distraction he won't forget," Mark said, a grim determination settling over him.
"We need to locate his camp.
And I have an idea for the distraction, something big and angry." They moved through the forest like shadows, Mark's trait making him invisible to the wildlife and any patrols they encountered. Lyra followed, her chosen abilities allowing her to blend with the environment, though she lacked Mark's perfect stealth.
After an hour of cautious travel, they reached a ridge overlooking a cleared valley.
Below, Kale's forces had established a temporary base, a chaotic sprawl of tents, magical barriers, and, most importantly, 3 massive siege engines. The engines were monstrous constructs of dark iron and glowing runes, each the size of a small house. They resembled catapults but with arcane crystals instead of stones, designed to blast through magical defenses like the sanctuary's wards. Guards patrolled around them, elite chosen in black armor marked with Kale's insignia, a serpent coiled around a sword.
Mark counted at least 20, plus 2 mages maintaining detection wards that shimmered in the air like heat haze.
"There," Lyra whispered, pointing to a large tent at the center of the camp.
"That's Kale's command post.
And look, to the east, near that rocky outcrop. I recognize that energy signature.
It's a dormant boss arena.
A stone titan, level 50, sleeps there.
Kale's forces have been avoiding it." Mark's mind raced.
A stone titan, a giant monster of rock and earth, slow but devastating in battle.
If lured into the camp.
"Perfect," he murmured. "I'll sabotage the siege engines first.
Then, I'll wake the Titan and lead it here. With the engines down, Kale won't have the firepower to drive it off quickly."
"How will you lure it?"
Lyra asked. "Titans only aggro on direct threats or specific triggers."
Mark held up Arcturus's shard.
"This. Arcturus's essence is tied to the earth. If I channel it near the Titan, it might stir, thinking it's a natural anomaly.
And once it's moving, I can guide it by staying just ahead. It won't see me as a target, but it'll follow the disturbance."
Lyra shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "You're insane."
"But it might work. I'll create a diversion on the west side, draw some guards away with a fake attack.
It'll give you a window."
They shared a nod, no words needed. Mark felt a strange pang. Trust was still new to him, but Lyra had proven herself. He slipped down the ridge, his small goblin form melding into the underbrush. The guards' patrol patterns were predictable. He timed his movements between their rounds, his heart pounding despite his trait. The detection wards loomed ahead, pulsing with a soft blue light. As he approached the nearest siege engine, he focused on the shard. Closing his eyes, he willed its energy to envelop him. A warm, earthy glow spread from the crystal, covering his body like a second skin. He stepped through the ward, the magic rippled but didn't alarm, reading him as a neutral environmental effect rather than a hostile entity.
Arcturus's essence was working.
The siege engine towered over him, its iron frame cold to the touch. Mark examined it quickly, his goblin eyes, keen for details, spotted the weak points. The arcane crystals were held in place by enchanted clamps, and a control rune was etched into the base. He pulled out a small, rusty dagger he'd looted long ago, useless in combat, but perfect for prying. With careful movements, he loosened the clamps on 2 of the crystals, just enough that they'd misfire under stress. Then, he scratched at the control rune, disrupting its pattern with grit and mud.
1 down. He repeated the process on the second engine, his hands trembling slightly.
The guards were close, he could hear their muttered conversations about the purge event and Kale's promised rewards. He finished the sabotage and moved to the third engine, but as he reached for the clamp, a guard turned suddenly, his eyes sweeping the area. Mark froze, pressed against the cold iron. The guard's gaze passed over him, seeing nothing. But then the guard frowned, sniffing the air. "Strange, smells like wet stone," he muttered to his companion. "Probably from the cavern's collapse," the other replied.
"Keep moving. Kale wants this area secure for the next phase."
They walked on, and Mark let out a silent breath. He finished the third engine, then pocketed a small, glowing artifact he found nearby, a siege core fragment, a rare item that could be used to power magical devices.
It might come in handy.
With the sabotage complete, he slipped away from the camp, heading east toward the rocky outcrop. The Stone Titan's arena was a barren circle of cracked earth and towering boulders, the monster itself a hulking form of gray rock that seemed part of the landscape. It slept in a crouched position, its head bowed, faint vibrations emanating from it like a slow heartbeat. Mark approached cautiously, the shard glowing brighter in his hand. He could feel its energy resonating with the earth beneath his feet. He placed the shard on the ground near the Titan's foot, then backed away. Focusing his will, he channeled a spark of intent through the crystal. The shard pulsed, and a wave of earthy energy rippled out, seeping into the ground. The Titan stirred, a deep, grinding sound like mountains shifting. One rocky eye cracked open, glowing with a dull orange light. Mark held his ground, his trait keeping him invisible.
The Titan rose slowly, shaking off centuries of sleep. It scanned the area, its gaze passing over Mark without recognition. Then, it focused on the shard, sensing the anomalous energy.
With a thunderous step, it moved toward it. Mark snatched up the shard and ran, not toward the camp directly, but in a wide arc, keeping just ahead of the Titan. The monster followed, its heavy footsteps cracking the earth, drawn by the shard's trail. Mark weaved through trees, his small size an advantage in the dense forest. Behind him, the Titan plowed through, uprooting trees and sending wildlife fleeing. As they neared the valley, Mark could hear the camp's alarms blaring. Lyra's diversion had worked, with shouts and magical flashes coming from the west. He burst into the cleared area, the Titan emerging behind him like a force of nature.
Guards turned, their eyes widening in horror. "Stone Titan. Level 50. Sound the alarm," one screamed. Chaos erupted. The Titan, now agitated by the sudden activity, roared and swung a massive fist, smashing a tent into splinters. Kale's forces scrambled to respond, but with the siege engines sabotaged, their ranged attacks were limited. Mark saw Kale himself emerge from his command tent, his face a mask of fury. The tyrannical chosen leader barked orders, directing mages to cast binding spells. Mark used the confusion to slip closer, staying in the Titan's shadow. He watched as Kale's mages focused their energy, weaving chains of light around the monster's legs. The Titan struggled, breaking one chain with a heave. In that moment, Mark spotted an opportunity. Kale had a pendant around his neck, glowing with the same energy as the rogue deity's artifacts. It might be a key item.
He moved like a whisper, dodging debris and fleeing soldiers.
The Titan's roars and the clash of magic filled the air.
Mark reached Kale's side, the chosen leader too preoccupied with directing the battle to notice the small goblin at his feet. Mark's hand closed around the pendant, his fingers brushing the cold metal. But as he tugged, Kale's head snapped down, not seeing Mark, but sensing the movement. His eyes narrowed, scanning the empty space.
What trickery is this?
Kale snarled, his hand moving to his sword.
Lyra's work? Or another of those zero aggro vermin?
Mark froze, the pendant half lifted. Kale's gaze swept over him, but without perception he saw only air, yet his instincts screamed of presence. The Titan roared again, breaking free and charging toward a group of archers, drawing Kale's attention back.
Mark yanked the pendant free and darted away, clutching it to his chest.
He retreated to the edge of the camp, where Lyra joined him, her diversion complete. She was breathing heavily, a bruise forming on her cheek.
Did it work? She asked.
Mark held up the pendant and nodded toward the siege engines. As if on cue, one of the mages tried to fire a crystal, it sparked and fizzled, then exploded in a shower of harmless light. The other engines similarly misfired, their attacks going wild or failing entirely. The Titan, now enraged, was tearing through Kale's ranks, its stone fists crushing armor and barriers.
We need to go, Lyra said. The system enforcers will be here soon, drawn by this much chaos. Mark took one last look at the battlefield.
Kale was shouting, his plans unraveling, yet his eyes still scanned the chaos as if trying to pierce the veil of invisibility. Mark met that gaze, or rather, faced it, knowing that Kale still couldn't perceive him directly, but the hunt was far from over. The rogue deities game had just escalated, and Mark had stolen a piece from the board. They vanished into the forest, the sounds of battle fading behind them, as the unseen saboteur left his mark on the war. The forest clearing echoed with the cacophony of battle, the stone titan's earth-shaking roars, the screams of Kale's forces, and the crackle of failing siege engines. Mark crouched behind a fallen log, his goblin heart pounding against his ribs. Beside him, Lyra pressed a hand to her side, where a shallow gash from their earlier escape still seeped blood. Her eyes, sharp with the Chosen's perception, scanned the chaos. "He's there," she whispered, pointing toward the center of the camp where Kale stood, his armor gleaming under the moonlight despite the dirt and debris. The tyrannical Chosen leader bellowed orders, his voice cutting through the din, but his gaze darted wildly, as if searching for a ghost. Mark clutched the pendant he'd stolen from Kale, a small, obsidian stone etched with runes that glowed faintly in his palm. It felt warm, almost alive, and his status screen flickered with a notification: item, pendant of dominion, critical for ritual of enslavement. He'd snatched it during the Titan's initial charge, his zero aggro trait making him as invisible as the wind. Now, as the battle raged, he knew this was the key. Kale's defeat hinged on this item, and Mark had to use it at the perfect moment. "The Titan's distracted by the siege engines," Lyra said, her voice strained. "But Kale's regrouping. He's got mages casting barriers. If he completes that ritual, he'll turn the Titan against the village." Mark nodded, his mind racing. The previous summary's events replayed in his head: the sabotage of the engines, the awakening of the Titan, the theft of the pendant. It had all led here, to this climax. He could see the ritual site ahead, a circle of stones where Kale's lieutenants were chanting, their hands raised toward a glowing altar. Without the pendant, the ritual was incomplete, but Kale was desperate. He'd try to substitute it with something else, and Mark couldn't let that happen. "I need to get closer," Mark murmured, his goblin voice a low rasp. "During the fight, when Kale's distracted by the Titan, I'll pocket the replacement item. That should cause the ritual to backfire." Lyra gripped his arm, her fingers cold. "Be careful. The system's been logging anomalies since you stole the orb. If you interfere too blatantly, it might intervene." Mark met her eyes, seeing the concern there. For a moment, he felt a pang of gratitude. This Chosen, who could see through his absolute neutrality, had become his only ally in a world that wanted him dead. But there was no time for sentiment. He slipped from behind the log, his small goblin form blending into the shadows as he moved toward the battle. The scene was apocalyptic. The Stone Titan, a hulking monstrosity of rock and moss, swung its massive fists, crushing tents and scattering soldiers. Kale's forces fought back with spells and arrows, but the sabotaged siege engines, their mechanisms jammed with debris Mark had inserted, lay in ruins, smoking and useless. Mark weaved through the chaos, his trait rendering him unnoticed. A soldier ran past him, screaming as a Titan's foot crushed the ground inches away. Mark didn't flinch, he'd grown accustomed to this invisibility, but today, it felt heavier, like a cloak of fate. He reached the edge of the ritual circle. Kale stood at the altar, his face contorted with rage. "Find that pendant," he roared at a lieutenant. "And bring the backup focus crystal. We'll complete this even if I have to drain every chosen here." The lieutenant scurried off, returning with a small, pulsating crystal that emitted a sickly green light. Mark's eyes narrowed. That was the critical item, the focus crystal of subjugation. If Kale used it in place of the pendant, the ritual would still work, albeit weaker. Mark had to steal it mid-fight. As Kale raised the crystal toward the altar, the Titan lunged forward, its roar shaking the very air. Kale turned, barking orders to his mages to reinforce the barriers. In that split second of distraction, Mark acted. He darted forward, his goblin hands swift and silent. The crystal was cold to the touch, vibrating with malevolent energy. He snatched it from Kale's grasp, pocketing it in his ragged tunic. Kale's hand closed on empty air, and he spun around, his eyes wide with confusion. "What in the system's name?" Kale snarled, but before he could react, the ritual circle flared with unstable energy. Without the crystal, the chanting lieutenants faltered, their spells unraveling. The altar cracked, and a wave of feedback exploded outward, knocking Kale to his knees. The Titan, sensing the disruption, turned its attention fully to the ritual site, its eyes glowing with primal fury. Mark retreated, clutching the crystal. He could feel the system's presence thickening in the air, a cold, digital sensation that made his skin crawl. Notifications flashed in his vision: anomaly detected, unauthorized item theft during active boss encounter. System AI intervention imminent. He ignored them, focusing on the chaos. Kale staggered to his feet, drawing a glowing sword. "Show yourself, coward," he screamed into the emptiness, swinging at the air. But Mark was already moving, circling to where Lyra waited. Suddenly, the world seemed to freeze. The battle sounds faded, replaced by a sterile, white void. Mark stumbled, disoriented. Before him, a figure materialized, a shimmering, humanoid form of light and data streams. The system AI. Its voice echoed, devoid of emotion. Entity designation: Goblin Scout Mark. Trait: absolute neutrality. Status: glitch. Action: deletion for balance violation. Mark's breath caught. This was it, the intervention Lyra had warned about. He tried to speak, but his voice was swallowed by the void. The AI raised a hand, and pain lanced through Mark's body, as if his very code were being rewritten. He fell to his knees, the crystal clattering from his grasp. In that moment, he thought of the village, of Lyra, of all the zero aggro entities he'd met. He couldn't die here, not after coming so far. Then, another presence emerged, a shadowy, amorphous shape that coalesced beside the AI. The rogue deity. Its voice was a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "This one is mine, system. A pawn in my game. You will not delete him." The AI's form flickered. Rogue entity detected. Interference prohibited. Glitch must be purged. "And risk unraveling the fabric you've woven," the deity hissed. "His trait is a flaw you created. Let him play his part." A stalemate hung in the air, the two forces locked in a silent struggle. Mark watched, helpless, as the void trembled. After what felt like an eternity, the AI relented, its light dimming. Entity Mark will be monitored. Further anomalies will result in immediate termination. Then, it vanished, and the world snapped back into focus. Mark found himself back in the clearing, the battle still raging. The Titan had Kale pinned, its massive hand pressing down on the chosen leader. Kale struggled, his armor cracking, but his eyes were fixed on where Mark had been. "I know you're there," he gasped. "You've ruined everything." Mark didn't hesitate. He scooped up the focus crystal and ran to Lyra, who was watching with a mix of awe and fear. "Now," he said, his voice urgent. "Expose him." Lyra nodded,
pulling out a communication orb she'd stolen during their earlier heists. She activated it, projecting Kale's image and voice recordings from their spying into the sky above the battlefield. The images showed Kale conspiring with the rogue deity, planning the enslavement of villages, and manipulating the system. The chosen forces, already demoralized by the Titan's assault, froze, their eyes wide with shock. "Kale is a traitor!" Lyra shouted, her voice amplified by the orb. "He's working with a rogue deity to corrupt the system. Look at the evidence." The effect was instantaneous. Kale's lieutenants hesitated, then began to lower their weapons. The Titan, sensing the shift, roared one final time before retreating into the forest, its task done. Kale, trapped under the Titan's fading grip, screamed in defiance, but it was too late. The chosen community turned on him, dragging him away as the ritual site collapsed into dust. Mark watched from the shadows, the crystal heavy in his hand. He'd done it, caused Kale's defeat without ever being seen. As the battle subsided, whispers spread among the chosen, "A ghost did this. An unseen savior. He was becoming a legend, a shadow in their stories." Lyra approached him, her expression weary but relieved. "It's over. For now." But as she spoke, the rogue deity's voice echoed in Mark's mind, soft and insidious. "Well played, little goblin. But this was merely a skirmish. The true game begins now. I have plans for you, and for all who hide in the shadows." Then, the presence faded, leaving Mark with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He looked at Lyra, then at the village in the distance, now safe. He hadn't gained strength or levels, but he'd proven that power could come from being beneath notice. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Mark slipped away into the forest, unseen but ever present, the promise of a greater conflict looming in his wake. The dust of battle settled over the ruined camp like a shroud. Mark stood amidst the wreckage, his goblin form blending with the shadows cast by the shattered siege engines and fallen banners. Around him, the aftermath of Kale's defeat unfolded. Chosen players argued over loot, system enforcers scanned for anomalies with glowing eyes, and the stone titan's corpse lay half buried in earth, its crystalline core now inert. Yet none glanced his way. To them, he was just another piece of the scenery, a level 1 Goblin Scout beneath notice. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from the weight of choice. The rogue deity's voice still echoed in his mind, a whisper that had cut through the chaos as the system AI retreated. "You are more than a glitch, Mark. You are a key. The system seeks order, but I offer freedom. Join me, and we will reshape this world." The offer had been tempting, a siren call to power after so long skulking in shadows. But as he watched Lyra tending to wounded villagers, her face smudged with dirt and determination, something shifted within him. He didn't want to be a pawn in another god's game. He wanted to be the hand that moved the pieces. Lyra spotted him, or rather, sensed him, her unique skill, eyes of the unseen, allowing her to perceive his presence despite his zero aggro. She limped over, favoring a leg injured during the final confrontation. "Mark? You're still here. I thought you'd vanish like a ghost after the show." Her tone was weary but held a note of respect. "I considered it," Mark admitted, his voice low. He gestured to the village beyond the camp, where survivors huddled around fires. "But look at them. Kale's gone, but there will be others. The system's broken, Lyra. It hunts anomalies like me while letting tyrants like Kale rise. I can't just walk away." Lyra studied him, her gaze piercing. "What are you proposing? You're a goblin with no combat stats. Even with your trait, you can't fight head-on." "I don't need to fight," Mark said, a plan crystallizing in his mind. "I need to watch. To listen. To be the shadow that protects when no one else can see the threat." He explained his idea, a network of zero-aggro entities, those like him who existed beneath the system's notice, working together to sabotage corruption and aid the weak. They wouldn't be heroes in the spotlight, they'd be whispers in the dark, using their invisibility to gather intelligence, steal crucial items, and manipulate events from the sidelines. Lyra's eyes widened. "It's insane. And brilliant. But how do we find others? The system purges them.
Mark smiled, a rare expression on his goblin features.
We start with the sanctuary. The survivors we met during the Purge event, they're hiding, but they're out there. And I have a feeling the rogue deity isn't the only one who can sense us. Over the next few days, Mark and Lyra worked in tandem.
Lyra used her status as a respected chosen to advocate for the village, securing resources and protection from sympathetic players.
Meanwhile, Mark slipped into the role he was born for, the unseen operative.
He visited the hidden sanctuary, a cavern system beneath the Whispering Woods where zero aggro mobs had gathered. There, he met Grumble, an ancient stonekin with moss-covered skin and eyes that held centuries of wisdom. "So you're the one causing all the ruckus," Grumble rumbled, his voice like grinding rocks. "We felt the system tremble when you stole that focus crystal. It's been a long time since someone disrupted the balance so boldly."
Mark bowed his head. "I didn't mean to put you all in danger. But I think we can turn this into an opportunity. If we organize, we can protect each other. Use our traits not just to survive, but to make a difference." Grumble considered this, stroking his stony chin.
"We are few, and the system's enforcers grow more vigilant.
But there is strength in numbers, even unseen ones." "Very well. I will spread the word. We shall become your eyes and ears, Mark. But remember, we are not soldiers. We are ghosts." With Grumble's support, Mark began building his network.
He assigned roles based on each entity's abilities: a silent sprite who could float through walls to spy, a dust mite that could infiltrate locked chests, even a phantom cat that could manipulate minor illusions. They communicated through coded messages left in hidden crevices, a web of information that spanned dungeons and towns. Mark trained them in stealth tactics, emphasizing the core principle of their existence: never engage directly. Their power lay in being forgotten the moment they passed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark perched on a rooftop overlooking the village. Below, children played, their laughter a stark contrast to the screams of battle that had echoed here days before. Lyra joined him, her movements silent thanks to a pair of enchanted boots Mark had acquired from a careless merchant. "They're calling you the Shadow Guardian in the taverns," Lyra said, handing him a piece of bread. "Rumors say a spirit protects this place, stealing from raiders and leaving supplies for the needy. They don't know it's a goblin with a broken Aggro Stat." Mark took the bread, savoring its simplicity. "Let them believe what they want. Myths are harder to hunt than mobs." He glanced at her. "What about you? You could be a hero out in the open. Why stay with a ghost?" Lyra's expression softened. "Because I've seen what heroes like Kale become. Power corrupts, Mark. But you have all the influence with none of the pride. It's refreshing. Besides," she added with a smirk, "someone has to keep you from getting too cocky." Their banter was cut short by a sudden chill in the air. The rogue deity's presence washed over them, not as a voice, but as a pressure that made the shadows deepen. A figure materialized from the darkness, tall, cloaked in shifting void, with eyes that held galaxies. It was the deity, manifesting in a form that only Mark and Lyra could perceive. "You reject my offer, yet you build an army of shadows," the deity said, its voice resonating in their minds. "Interesting. You seek to challenge the system without becoming part of its game." Mark stood his ground, though every instinct screamed to flee. "I'm not challenging it. I'm fixing its mistakes. The system should protect the weak, not hunt them." The deity laughed, a sound like crumbling stars. "Naive. The system is a tool of order, but order requires control. Your network is a flaw, Mark. One I can exploit, or protect. The conflict is coming, a war between my kind and the system's architects. Choose a side, or be crushed in the crossfire." Mark met its gaze. "I choose my own side. The side of those who have no voice." For a long moment, the deity studied him. Then it nodded slowly. "So be it. We will meet again, Shadow Guardian. Until then, watch over your world. But know this, the balance is shifting. New threats will emerge, and your zero aggro may not save you from them all.
With that, it dissolved into mist, leaving behind only the scent of ozone. Lyra let out a shaky breath. Well, that was ominous. What now?
Now we prepare, Mark said, turning back to the village.
We strengthen the network, expand our reach. There are other villages, other tyrants.
And we have the advantage of being unseen. He detailed his plans, establishing safe houses, creating contingency protocols, even planting agents within chosen guilds to monitor for corruption. It was a slow, meticulous process, but it was theirs. As weeks turned into months, Mark's legend grew, though no one knew his true form. Stories spread of a phantom that could walk through monster hordes untouched, a thief who stole from the rich to give to the poor, a whisper that warned of dangers before they struck. Chosen players debated whether it was a hidden quest or a glitch, but to the villagers and the Zero Aggro network, it was hope.
Mark never gained a single level.
His stats remained those of a level 1 Goblin Scout, his aggro locked at 0. But he gained something more valuable: purpose. He spent his days coordinating missions, from sabotaging a slaver's caravan by pocketing its lockpicks to leaking plans of a corrupt guild's raid. Each success was small, but together, they wove a tapestry of resistance.
One crisp morning, Mark stood at the edge of the Whispering Woods, watching the village awaken. Smoke curled from chimneys, and farmers tended their fields, unaware of the goblin in their midst.
Lyra approached, her gear upgraded with artifacts they'd liberated from dungeons.
Grumble reports that 3 new Zero Aggro entities have joined the network, she said.
A gloom bat in the northern caves and 2 mistwalkers from the Swamp of Sighs. They're already providing intel on a bandit group planning to attack a nearby hamlet.
Mark nodded.
Send the Silent Sprite to intercept. Have it swap their maps with falsified ones.
Let them get lost in the wilderness for a while.
He paused, looking at the horizon where storm clouds gathered. The rogue deity was right about one thing: the conflict is coming.
But we'll be ready. We'll be the unseen shield.
Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity.
You've come a long way from that scared goblin in a cave.
I had a good teacher, Mark replied, smiling. Together, they faded into the shadows, their presence vanishing as if they'd never been there. The story closes with Mark watching over the world, a silent sentinel in a realm of chaos. From the highest dungeons to the lowest slums, his network thrived, a testament to the power of being beneath notice. The rogue deity's threat loomed like a storm on the horizon, promising battles that would shake the system to its core. But for now, in the quiet moments between crises, Mark found peace in his role. He was not a hero, not a chosen, not even a threat. He was a ghost, a whisper, a guardian unseen. And as the sun rose on a new day, he knew that sometimes, the greatest strength was in having no aggro at all.